Buenos días a todos y a todas. Good morning. It's June 30th, 2022, 9 a.m. And we are here to enjoy a seminar, a symposium, Latino Latina Mental Health Issues. So good morning, respected colleagues and friends of the University of Illinois, Chicago, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois, Springfield. Welcome, buenos días, estimados colegas y amigos de la Universidad de Illinois. Bienvenidos, bienvenidos investigadores de varias universidades de México, universidades de la República del Salvador, de Colombia, de Argentina y otros países. A special welcome to students and to distinguished authorities and executives from different institutions. Gracias por su distinguida presencia. Thank you for your kind presence today. My name is Elvira de Mejia, a professor in food science and human nutrition, the director of the Division of Nutritional Sciences, and a past presidential fellow at the University of Illinois System. Welcome to the fourth Symposium of I-MMAS initiative, the University of Illinois Mexican and Mexican-American Student Initiative. I'm humbled and thankful to facilitate this important and urgent initiative. I thank the president of the University of Illinois, Dr. Tim Killeen, for his leadership and enthusiasm recognizing the need and the opportunity that I-MMAS represents. I-MMAS represents a culture of support, building pipelines for Mexican and Mexican-American students, smoothing the path and retaining as many talented students as possible, building a network of collaborators. I-MMAS is about partnering in collaboration with our peers in Mexico. I-MMAS will enhance ongoing efforts by the system's 3 universities to increase Mexican and Mexican-American recruitment and expand their educational opportunities. I feel proud to be part of the 4th I-MMAS Symposium on Latino Latina Mental Health, with the participation of distinguished researchers from Mexico and the US. This symposium was organized by Dr. Stephanie Torres, an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. The symposium will highlight cutting-edge research, including the impact of immigration policy and climate on mental health care, best practices for culturally sensitive care, and promoting resiliency among the Latino Latina communities. Today, we thank all of authorities and representatives of different institutions for their presence and remarks. Now is my privilege to introduce the 20th president of the University of Illinois, Dr. Timothy Killeen. Dr. Killeen took office in May 2015 and has led a new wave of growth for the state flagship university system. System-wide enrollment has grown to a record more than 90,000 students. A new presidential initiative is adding new world-class faculty, and the system is leading to pioneering new educational and innovative initiatives, the Discovery Partners Institute and Illinois Innovation Network. Dr. Killeen has more than 3 decades of experience as a teacher, researcher, and administrator in public higher education and in top leadership positions with national scientific research agencies. Before coming to Illinois, he served as Vice Chancellor for Research at the State University of New York, where he also headed the nation's most comprehensive university connected research foundation. Earlier, he served as head of geosciences at the National Science Foundation, which provides more than a quarter of federal research funds for US universities. He also spent more than 20 years as a faculty member and administrator at the University of Michigan. Now we will have some remarks from President Tim Killeen, President of the University of Illinois.
Thank you, Elvira, and good morning and welcome. Bienvenidos to this symposium on the pressing issue of Latino Latina mental health. On behalf of the University of Illinois system, I want to thank all of our dedicated partners in this effort. Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Querétaro, México, Instituto Nacional de Psiquiatría Ramón de la Fuente Muñiz, México, Universidad Autónoma de San Luis Potosí, México, Long School of Medicine, UT Health, San Antonio, and our own 3 universities in Urbana-Champaign, Chicago, and Springfield. We are grateful for your passion and your participation. I'm incredibly proud of the continued growth and momentum of I-MMAS in cultivating cross-border partnerships and collaboration. This is our 4th I-MMAS symposium, and I have to say they just keep getting better and better. When I-MMAS was created, a major goal was to begin developing new opportunities for students to travel between our universities and to provide life-changing educational opportunities for more Mexican students here at the U of I. I'm delighted to say we're making significant advances in this area. But we are also building deep connections around research and discovery, links between the brilliant minds at work in our 3 universities in Illinois and those at our distinguished partner institutions in Mexico. Through these developing networks, we can work together to identify needs, acquire a deeper understanding, and develop synergies. We can leverage the power of collaboration to create opportunities for the people of Mexico and the people of Illinois, and solve problems that affect all of us. For this symposium, we are proud to partner with the leading mental health researchers from Mexico and the US, including from all 3 of our own world-class universities within the University of Illinois system, a genuine brain trust gathered here to address the increasingly critical matter of Latino Latina mental health. Some of you may know this, but the seed for this symposium was actually planted about a year ago when Jaime Di Paulo, president of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce, approached Elvira with growing concerns. Jaime said to her, if you want to solve problems, if you want to have impact on the Latino, Latina, and Hispanic communities, and impact, by the way, is the U of I system's distinct superpower. It is, in fact, our charge as the state's largest public university system. If you want to have impact, you must talk about mental health. You have to understand the underlying issues and commit to addressing them, to lifting up these populations, which comprise 78% of all underrepresented groups in Illinois, 78%. Today, those of us in this room are understanding more than ever the myriad barriers that are putting Latino Latina individuals at greater risk for maintaining good mental health and keeping them from reaching their full potential for overall well-being. Disparities in access to and quality of mental health care, cultural and linguistic barriers, higher levels of poverty, being uninsured or underinsured, a lack of cultural sensitivity and competence among mental health practitioners, perceptions of stigma within these cultures, the effects of immigration policy and immigration climate. That last one, the effects of immigration policy and immigration climate on the health and well-being of our Latino, Latina individuals and communities, is our particular focus today. Over the next several hours, leading experts will dig deeper into these and other issues that are fundamental to our shared future. Researchers who are among the experts in their fields are part of this symposium and will lead discussions around such topics as social determinants of health and their impact on health and well-being of Latino Latina caregivers of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. You'll be a part of conversations on the effects of trauma in Latino families, overcoming family violence, and much more. Our hope is to work towards identifying means for greater prevention and resiliency, and to understand how to facilitate processes that will support better mental health in the future. But we must also continue the conversation once we leave here, coming together to implement practical, actionable solutions. This symposium offers the chance to establish a platform for researchers to further connect, communicate, and build teams to keep the momentum going forward, to provide answers to the critical questions: where do we go from here? How do we build on what research today tells us? All of us must continue to work together to chart that path forward. Solutions will come from connections made in gatherings just like this one and future events led by I-MMAS. It gives me a great sense of pride that together our universities can be a force for good and drive the changes that are necessary to address well-being and to build healthy, prosperous, sustainable communities for Mexico, Illinois, and all of North America. So again, bienvenidos y muchas gracias. Thank you for being a part of this symposium and sharing your expertise, your energy, and your commitment to creating a better tomorrow.
Thank you very much, President Tim Killeen. It is a great distinction to introduce Trustee Ramón Cepeda, member of the Board of Trustees, the governing body of the University of Illinois. Trustee Cepeda is a leader, eminent professional, and a supporter of the Latino Latina communities. Trustee Cepeda.
Good morning. On behalf of the University of Illinois Board of Trustees, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Illinois Mexican and Mexican-American Student Symposium, Symposium. I'd like to thank Dr.Elvira de Mejia for taking up this effort and inviting me to welcome you. I'd also like to thank Consul Reyna, Torres, Mendivil for joining us and being a great partner in our efforts. It seems such a long time ago, but Dr. de Mejia, President Killeen, and I were part of a delegation that went to Mexico to start, what I believe, to plant the seeds for I-MMAS. We visited Tec de Monterrey, we visited UNAM, among other public agencies and private agencies, and a tour that I really feel kicked off these efforts. And soon we shall open an office in UNAM. We've come a long way there. In fact, I remember President Killeen standing up in a room full of students at UNAM and doing a question and answering it. I asked the group if anybody had heard of the University of Illinois. None had not. But I think we've changed that. As a Mexicano, I'm proud to have a system, like I-MMAS, not only to increase the population of Mexicanos at the university system, but to build this large scale presence with Mexican academia, research, and private sector institutions. Today's topic on mental health is especially important, given all that has happened in the past 2 years with COVID. But sadly, this is not a new topic. This topic affects our community and has not gotten the type of attention that it needs. I'm really looking forward to hearing our distinguished panel of experts on this subject. So, bienvenidos a todos y gracias.
Muchas gracias, Trustee Cepeda. Now we have some remarks from Ambassador Reyna Torres, Mendivil, Consul General de México in Chicago, USA. Ambassador Torres.
Thank you so much, Elvira. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos a todas las personas de México que nos acompañan en este simposio. Thank you so much. I want to start to commend I-MMAS for this outstanding job that they are doing and shedding light on one of the most important issues for our community. Of course, President Killeen, your leadership has always been amazing. The fact that you are such a good friend of Mexico and that you want from the beginning, since you took office in this university, in the University of Illinois system, you've been fighting to strengthen the ties with Mexico and strengthen the different areas of research and opportunities for students. I really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward for what is to come in the next months. One of those things, opening an office in my alma mater, UNAM, la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. And of course, Trustee Ramón Cepeda, he's the voice of our community in the Board of Trustees of this university. I think that the fact that we have somebody of Mexican origin in the Board of Trustees strengthen the possibilities for the University of Illinois to reach out and be connected with the needs of our community. I just want to say that the issue of mental health has always been in the agenda of the Mexican programs that we put together for our communities. It's an issue that is very complicated, and President Killeen mentioned why. There are many variables that influence how this issue is dealt with among our community in the U.S. Among those, many of those have to do with culture, but of course, what's going on in politics, and if people have access to insurance, health insurance or not. But what I want to say today, and that's why I really commend the fact that you organized the symposium, is that this is an issue that for us has become binational, transborder. We have 35 million people of Mexican origin in this country, and they come, and they have come, and their parents came, and their grandparents came with all those things that they learned in Mexico. This is an issue that is not spoken, commonly among families. So things have always been complicated for our migrant community. Our colleagues from San Antonio that are here with us can say that the trauma and the tragedy that goes with the fact of the flows of migration is always there. So I think that now, after the pandemic, and when we see what's going on with the migrant community, is more important than ever that we have this symposium. So mucho éxito, que su trabajo sea muy productivo, and we're looking forward for the results. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, embajadora. Siempre un honor tenerla con nosotros. Y gracias por su apoyo a la comunidad mexicana. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for your support to the Mexican community. Very good. So now we have Dr. Amalia Pallares, Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Engagement, Professor of Political Sciences and Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, to present her remarks. Is she here?
Yes, I'm here.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Mejia. Thank you so much. Hello to all my colleagues and our members of the Board of Trustees, President Killeen, and to so many colleagues that I see and recognize here. I want to, first of all, just thank you for organizing this. As somebody who is both a scholar of migrant communities, the Chief Diversity Officer in a Hispanic serving institution like UIC, and have, have like experience like many Latino communities, mental health in our families, and experienced what that's like. I just can't think of a more important topic. In my scholarly trajectory, I've had the opportunities to be able to, learn a lot about migrant communities and the ways in which they are not only facing the usual things we think about, family separation, deportation, and how this impacts their mental health, but even the everyday things that we don't necessarily always look at in terms of mixed status families, things like, the ways in which citizens who have siblings who are undocumented feel a sense of like responsibility, and how that's a stressor, or guilt, and that's a stressor, or how, for example, undocumented youth have to think about supporting their undocumented parents who don't have access to Social Security. What does that mean for their life plans and their livelihood, and many, many other things. I still remember in the work that I've done at UIC for 26 years, a student who was facing a lot of family pressures and was having to face a lot of academic responsibilities at the same time that many things were falling apart in her family because of migration pressures, told me it shouldn't have to be this way. And I still remember that. It shouldn't have to be this way. And I think the people who are here, who both in their scholarly and clinical work, are thinking seriously about those questions of it shouldn't have to be this way. I'm excited for the day. I thank you for your work. And I think that for the work that we all are doing, everybody in this room is doing to help improve conditions and the mental health of our Latino communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Thank you very much. So now let me tell you that the president of the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Jaime Di Paulo, suggested the theme for this symposium. And it's great to have him here. So Mr. Di Paulo, please, your remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Elvira. I'd like to thank Dr. Killeen for listening to my concerns, because mental health, it is an issue. It is an issue for everybody. We represent 120,000 Latino business owners in the state of Illinois. And you're probably thinking, what does business has to do with mental health? Well, has everything to do with businesses. And the fact that we're having this symposium talking about it, I think is a great step to start addressing the issue, because it's really affecting minority communities, especially in the state of Illinois. I have seen personally the devastation that the COVID has done to business owners in the state of Illinois, especially Latinos and Mexican business owners. So addressing this issue is huge. I personally, because of COVID, my daughter suffers from mental health issues, because what happens, I happen to have the resources to take care of it. But there's thousands and thousands of people out there that really need mental health and doesn't even understand the issue. So having this symposium is great, and I appreciate it. On behalf of the thousands of Latino businesses in the state of Illinois, I really want to thank the university for taking an opportunity and really addressing this issue. So thank you so much, Dr. Killeen, Dr. Embajadora Reyna, Torres, Mendivil, un placer saludarla y gracias por estar aquí. A mi amigo Ramón Cepeda, un placer y es un honor tenerte como trustee en la universidad. Y a todos los escuchas y las universidades de México, y sobre todo a mi universidad, la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, es un placer estar aquí. Gracias y mucho éxito.
Muchas gracias. Thank you to all of you for your kind words. The objective of this symposium is to promote strategic synergies among scientists in Mexico and Illinois on mental health, related research and development. So now let's get started. There will be a series of presentations, 20 minutes each, by outstanding scientists from Mexico and the US. Our gratitude to all the speakers, to all the presenters. Please write your questions in the chat, and we will make sure to request the speakers to answer your questions at the end of the symposium during the discussion session. The symposium will be recorded. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. She will share her slides now. Assistant Professor in the Department of Educational Psychology, College of Education, University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Torres is the organizer of this symposium, and we thank her for her leadership. So now we will start the presentations with Dr. Stephanie Torres, Assistant Professor, Department of Educational Psychology, College of Education. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Elvira. Bienvenidos a todos. Mucho gusto estar aquí. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the introduction, Doctora de Mejia. Welcome again. My name is Doctora Stephanie Torres. And as Dr. de Mejia mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology here at UIC. And I'm honored to be part of this symposium and help organize it. This is my passion, Latino mental health. As a licensed clinical psychologist, as well as a researcher in this area, I'm really excited to kick off this symposium. So today, I wanted to start us off by talking about trauma-informed care within immigrant Latino families, a public health approach. And a little bit about me. Here's my contact information. If anyone feel free to reach out to me with any questions, or if you want to chat further. My program of research really intersects clinical psychology, public health, community psychology, and I'm interested in ecological risk and resilience factors among low-income Latino communities, particularly Latino families impacted by immigration-related stress. So I'm really interested in how immigration climate, immigration policies really trickle down and impact well-being and mental health, not only among immigrant parents, but also children that were born here in the United States. I'm also really interested in using community-based participatory research, which is the notion of working with communities, not on communities, to come up with solutions to really figure out ways to combat the stress of the structural systems in place that may impact mental health. So I'm really excited today to talk a little bit about why trauma-informed care is important. And I always like to start with this slide. And I know I might be preaching to the choir, but why does Latino mental health matter? Here are some core statistics. In the United States, 1 in 7 people is an immigrant. 1 in 8 residents is a native-born US citizen with at least 1 immigrant parent. At least almost 80 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes or are refugees. Among the nearly 26 million refugees, half of whom are under the age of 18. 28 million immigrant workers comprise 17% of the US labor force. Over 4 million work in healthcare and social services. And also as consumers, immigrants add over $1 trillion to the US economy. And you can see some statistics here. And when we look at specifically Latino immigration, right, we can see here the top 10 areas by Hispanic Latino population, and we see Chicago right here in the middle. 19 million Latino and Hispanic immigrants currently reside in the United States. 2 million US-born Latino children are children of immigrants. 17% of Latino children are undocumented, and 40% have at least 1 undocumented parent. This is what we call a mixed status family. Mexican origin immigrants continue to comprise the largest demographic of immigrants, which is about 25%. And of course, of note, the Latino experience is very unique, of course, and there are differences within different subgroups, Mexicanos, Dominicanos, from El Salvador, and also within subgroups within our own Mexican community. So despite the fact that Latinos have accounted for over half of the US population growth, they continue to face striking health disparities. So these are just a few statistics that I wanted to share with you all. Rates of mental illness are increasing among Latino populations, especially depressive episodes or major depressive disorder. Despite this alarming number, 51.2, so half of Latino individuals do not receive treatment. And of course, these are due to a multitude of barriers in accessing care that we'll talk about throughout our symposium today. This could be lack of insurance, lack of knowledge or awareness that these resources exist, stigma within the community of seeking external help for one's family problems, as well as immigration factors, fear of deportation, being asked for an ID when accessing a clinic. These things contribute to these alarming disparities. And what I want to focus on specifically, oops, oh boy, okay, 1 second. My PowerPoint just closed. That's nice. Okay, 1 moment. Sorry, everyone. Okay. All right, aquí estamos. Okay. ¿Se puede ver?
Sí.
Okay, gracias. All right, so, perdóname. So what I want to focus on today specifically is trauma within the Latino immigrant community. So given the stark rates of mental health disparities, I want to think about how does this turn into perhaps a diagnosable disorder like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. So we all know the word stress, right? Stress is the way our body responds to day-to-day struggles and demands of our lives. And a bit of stress we know can be healthy, right? It can motivate us before a test or before like a sports meet. But when we experience too much stress, it creates this wear and tear on our bodies and can really impact us in physical and emotional ways. So there's stress, and then there's trauma. And before we talk about trauma-informed care, I wanted to get on the same page about our definition of trauma. So what is trauma? So trauma is comprised of what we call the 3 E's. So the first E of trauma is the event. So events that include actual or extreme threat of physical and psychological harm. So this event might be a single occurrence, or it could be something chronic over time. So for example, if a Latino kid is exposed to community violence. That could be chronic, a car accident, that could be a single occurrence, right? And it's really the interpretation of the event that leads to someone endorsing trauma. So I always like to say, experiencing a trauma doesn't mean you are traumatized. Trauma does not equal traumatized. The second E is the experiences, like I mentioned. You know, what is that individual, how does that individual experience the event? Every person experiences the event differently. It's how the individual labels the event, assigns meaning, and how their life is disrupted from this trauma. And the effects are really what we see when we think about post-traumatic stress disorder or long-term trauma impacts. What are the effects of the event? These can be short to long-term and include things such as the inability to cope, difficulty with memory, attention, thinking, regulating behavior. So when we think of trauma, think of the 3 E's. It's an event that leads to an experience and that may or may not have long-lasting effects. And let's think about stress.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. Let's think about stress and trauma within the Latino community, specifically Latino immigrant community. So I wanted to show this slide, and I'm happy to go into more detail during our Q&A, but in what ways can stress and trauma impact the Latino immigrant community? These are stages of migration some, but not all Latino immigrants may face from their host country to their home country. So for brevity's sake, these include pre-migration, transit, asylum, and temporary resettlement, and settlement, or what we call post-migration. So let's think about it this way, right? So if a family is coming from Mexico, they may experience pre-migration stress or trauma, or stress and trauma in one's home country. The reason why they fled their home country, this could be poverty, lack of educational opportunities, violence, etc. And then they carry that stress and trauma and go on their transit journey, which may look very different for many folks, but it could include things such as, assault, riding a train, isolation, and folks getting separated. Most notably, we heard of the tragedy that occurred at our border, which left over 50 migrants dead trying to make a journey to the United States, right? Then we have asylum or temporary resettlement, which may or may not be applicable, but these are folks who may be waiting at the border due to some of the laws of our country, like Remain in Mexico or Title 42. And that may include another type of trauma or stress, waiting at the border to be let across. And then finally, we have settlement or post-migration. And, unfortunately, we know when immigrants arrive to the United States, they continue to face, stress and trauma, sometimes even more, due to discrimination, immigration laws, etc. And I'm going to focus on the settlement post-migration and what folks may experience in the United States. But again, know that this is cumulative, right? This builds up and folks continue to carry that burden of stress and trauma all the way from Mexico to the United States. So post-migration stress and trauma, again, is the stress that may occur once folks are in the United States. So this can look like immigration stress, discrimination stress, and language-related stress, among others. But let's think about these 3 buckets. So immigration stress can be defined as stress due to limited contact with family and friends, right? Losing that huge social network in one's home country. Fear of being deported, not only if one's undocumented, but also documented folks have a lot of fears around deportation as well for their own family members. Problems finding work due to legal reasons, but also in general as a new immigrant, as well as family separation. Perhaps it's one family member was left behind to get money and then sent for, or separation due to our border laws. We also have discrimination stress, and discrimination can occur on multiple levels, right? It's not just the person-to-person immigration stress that we've seen in the media, but also discrimination by laws, by institutions, social attitudes, biases about who immigrants are, and coming into this country and stealing jobs. All of that rhetoric is discrimination and causes stress. And then finally, language-related stress, difficulty communicating, but also linguistic isolation, especially in places that are more newcomer destinations, right? Not having folks that speak the language you do. And all of these stresses kind of interact to create something called a climate of fear, right? And this can lead to isolation, decreased sense of safety, and then ultimately lead to poor mental health like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So why do we need trauma-informed care? And how does this map on to what I just talked about, the stress and trauma families carry throughout their stages of migration? So I like to think of this visual here. So everyone carries this individual backpack. You can see this kiddo here carrying things like inequity, access, poverty, mental health. But think about this in terms of being an immigrant Latino, right? So everyone carries the stress, the trauma, the different burdens, the worries, the fears from one's home country all the way to the United States. And that gets really hard to carry. It's a huge burden to carry that on your back every single day. So as clinicians, educators, researchers, policymakers, everyone, we can all work together to reshuffle the backpack so it's a little bit easier to carry, but also work towards eliminating some stressors through policy and advocacy that makes it a little bit easier to carry. And that's trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care is typically defined by the 4 R's, right? So 4 R's being realize, recognize, respond, and resist traumatization. So what does this all mean? So firstly, in trauma-informed care, the first pillar is realizing. So realizing the widespread impact of trauma, realizing that, you know, kids in your classroom may have experienced trauma, in your offices, in your businesses. Understand that trauma is pervasive, and especially, you know, among our Latino community. And reframing that to what is wrong with you to what happened to you. That is a core part of trauma-informed care, shifting that thinking. And then recognizing what trauma might look like. Trauma looks really differently in different people. For kids, it might be acting out, being the quote unquote bad kid in classroom. For work, it might be folks who show up late or don't go to meetings or you know, don't finish their work on time, you know, realizing that trauma can present itself in different ways. And then responding, figuring out ways that if you're not a clinician or a therapist, to know where someone can go for help and encourage and empower folks to go. And then resisting re-traumatization. So ensuring and intentionally making sure that your workplace, the spaces you operate in, don't re-traumatize that person who is in that space. And this brings us to thinking about trauma-informed care through a public health framework. And when we think about treating trauma, we think about therapy sessions, right? Which is something I do. I trauma-informed therapy. You know, I have clients in my office, I run groups, but there are universal things that we can do to promote trauma-informed care, all of us. And this is public health, right? Public health is considering how to intervene, how to prevent on multiple levels. And equally, if not more important, are these interventions that occur on the universal level. And that's what I want to focus on for the rest of the presentation. So when we think about trauma-informed care, I wanted to introduce 2 different definitions. So post-traumatic growth and resilience. We've probably heard of resilience, but I want to introduce these 2 because I think they're important in thinking about how we can promote a culture of care. So post-traumatic growth, or PTG, is positive psychological change experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. Resilience is the ability to go on with life after hardship and adversity, or to continue living a purposeful life after experience hardship and adversity. So the key difference is bouncing back to how you were before the trauma, and PTG is bouncing beyond. So we want to create a culture of care and where not only folks can bounce back to their functioning before whatever happened to them, but also bounce beyond, have a positive change experience as a result of this struggle, bring out strength, bring out resilience, bring out empowerment. And there it is. There's also the importance of intervening on all levels to promote PTG and resilience. Trauma-informed care is not only at the individual level, but it's promoting healing and well-being among parents, schools, churches, community centers, and ultimately this, trauma-informed policies. A guiding pillar of trauma-informed care are these 6 principles put forth by SAMHSA. And I wanted to talk about the practical applications of these on the next slide. But the 6 are safety, promoting trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, voice, and choice, and thinking about intersectionality or cultural, historical, and gender issues. So how do we take these 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed care and put them into practice? So first, I talked about safety, right? So we need to all work together to create a safe environment. So how do we make sure everyone feels supported? And safety is not just physically safe, it's also psychologically and emotional safe, right? So if we're in an organization, if we're in a school, how do we create a space that feels safe to folks? Is this welcoming signs, well-lit hallways, lack of loud noises, right? Think about the backpacks these folks carry when they enter that space. And also creating a safe environment is feeling safe with yourself. So how do we promote self-esteem and self-worth within each individual? Trustworthiness is that second pillar. Building and maintaining trust with honesty and transparency. So how do we build and maintain trust? How does that trust look like to other folks, right? How do we prove that we're there in the long term, not just the short term, right? For what's ever happening in the moment. Connect individuals with peers with lived experiences. Emphasize that no one is alone. We know in mental health and well-being that peer support is incredibly helpful, right? Groups connecting with folks that maybe have the same experiences you do, right? And so how do we connect folks with these individuals? Support can help with a sense of hope. How do we promote supportive relationships in our places and spaces we're at? Everyone has a role in promoting a culture of care. Collaboration is key. Healing always happens in relationships, especially when you think about trauma, right? You think about a parent and child separation. A lot of times kids blame their parents, especially younger kids, of why did you leave me? Why did you abandon me, right? That child cannot heal by themselves, right? Healing occurs in relationships. And everyone has a role to play. So not only therapists and counselors, but other folks can help them along their journey. It's a team effort. Empowerment and choice. So every individual has a strength, has a talent, has a skill. You know, when trauma happens, your sense of control just really ruptures, right? The world is unsafe. So how do you help folks get that control back? And that often happens through self-efficacy, through teaching coping skills, through really telling folks that everyone does have a strength, right? And then finally, intersectionality. So attention to how identities intersect. Immigration really intersects with race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, religion, and so forth. So you're not just a Latino immigrant. You're a Latino immigrant who is darker skinned, who identifies as gay, who is Catholic, right? All those things really interact. And this brings us to active listening. So this is a skill that is really therapy 101, but that I love to teach to folks no matter what career you have. And active listening seems like, kind of like a given, right? We all listen, but we don't necessarily all hear, right? Listening is an active process. We need to show folks that have trauma and that are stressed that we're listening. And these can be things such as verbal and nonverbal communication, encouraging sharing, open-ended questions. Tell me about your day today versus was your day good or bad, right? What kind of things can we do to stimulate the conversation? reflecting back what you heard. For example, you know, it sounds like you're doing your best, but it's a lot to handle for one person, right? Really showing that person that you actually are hearing what they're saying and striving to understand, validate their feelings, whether or not you feel like you would have done the situation differently, offer praise. Great, you know, I really love how you shared that, was really brave of you. And ultimately letting them know it's not their fault. So in the couple of minutes I have left, I know I'm running out of time. I wanted to show this slide really quickly. And this is something called psychological first aid, which is from the American Red Cross. And it basically is, the whole point is that folks need safety and comfort, calmness, connectedness, self and community efficacy, as well as hope. And PFA, or psychological first aid, they have trainings. And these are a lot of the active listening skills I'm really talking about. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A. So basically, trauma-informed care is not a curriculum. It's not about checking a list. It's not about completing a training. It's about a shift. It's a shift in how we interact with individuals and how we listen. So as a final example, these traditional ways of thinking versus trauma-informed, these are kind of the lessons I want folks to leave with today. So a traditional way of thinking might be, challenging behaviors are a result of individual deficits. What's wrong with you? Whereas a trauma-informed way is, challenging behaviors may be ways of coping with traumatic experiences. What's happened to you? Traditional might be, we have to focus on fixing an individual. And a trauma-informed way might be, we have to focus on fixing the environment. And so thank you so much for listening for today. I just had one more slide that I'm happy to talk about more, just more about like the therapy approaches I might use. But just as an ending word, you know, we can all be trauma informed. We can all use these active listening skills, and everybody just wants a sense of safety, hope, and empowerment. And thank you again for attending this symposium presentation. And I'm excited to welcome our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I wanted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Beatriz Elba Schmukler from the Department of Political and Social Sciences, Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro, Mexico.
Hello. I thank you so much for this invitation. I hope it will help to get closer American and Illinois University and Mexican universities. I am really happy for this possibility. I want to tell you that I will not be so didactic as the first speaker because I will speak, I will talk, I will not make didactic drawings, but I will tell you that I have been working on prevention of violence through many diplomados and master programs and different programs for stopping the violence against women, and not only against women, because really I have been working on gender violence questions, and gender violence implies violence against children, violence against women, violence against men, violence against young people, violence against all the diversity of people with the diverse gender identities. So more and more we are looking at ways in which violence is really having consequences on mental health, very important. And also we are talking of emotional health and affective health, ways of living with other people in a nutritional way, and not only living with other people in supposedly family virtuous, family normal life, and really normal life is violent life usually. So this is what we are worried about, especially working with vulnerable very vulnerable communities, which are not weak communities, because communities are strong together very often, but it is difficult for them to look ways in which they can live, communities can live in a way that respect each other, get out of authoritarian ways of relationships. And this is what we are looking at when we are talking about family democratization processes. And then the concept of violence and prevention of violence is working on ways in which people relate to each other in communities, in families, and can get out from authoritarian ways of relationships. So this presentation analyzes the training programs. Next, Nancy, if you can put the next slide. Okay, thank you. This presentation analyzes the training programs that we have carried out in Mexico with the support of several universities since the year 2000. I was working first in Instituto Mora, and together with UNDP, we organized a pilot project which really helped us to look at ways in which family violence was really making the lives of people really terrible, and they didn't see how to get out of violence and how to start other ways of relationships among people. How it is related to mental health. Of course, universities' educational programs are beneficial to students' mental and emotional health, since it helps them to discover how gender norms, mandato de género, mandatory gender rules have constrained their lives and may choose new ways to build up relationships based on corresponsible care and love. What we talk about corresponsible, it means equal relationships, solidarity relationships, and all kinds of ways of supporting each other in feminist organizations. In feminist, excuse me, I was talking of family organization. Mexico is currently through a historic moment, a new kind of feminist movement, due to the intensification of the feminist movement that aroused among young people in protest of the different forms of violence inflicted on women in 2019 and 2020 during the pandemic period. Years of significant growth in marginalization and poverty, combined with the COVID-19 pandemic, numerous mass movements caused several universities to go on strike. Young women took to the streets, calling forth highly diverse collective and social actors. It was a new type of movement with a main actor, distinctive diversity, and in many ways different from previous feminist movements. In previous feminist movements, women were much related to our sufferings among our lives. Young women, of course, they feel the same, but I'm worried about the problem that feminist movements have separated young and old feminists at this moment. Also, it has separated women from men and from people. At this moment, I think there is a problem also, that is the feminist movement becomes almost an old movement, and the diversity movement is becoming more and more important than feminist movement. And I think really we are talking about the same lines of fighting against rules, gender rules who are dominating us, and who are not getting us to be free to choose our ways of living our identities. So I am really worried about these young women movements are taking the struggle against gender norms, but in ways in which they isolate themselves as women and don't care about how to get together with men and with boys and with different identities getting together to fight against gender rules. So this is my main worry in the struggle against violence in families and in communities. So it's not very clear how we can go through these educational programs in order to get together men and women from different identities, gender identities, and how can we help families to struggle against authoritarianism in families and make families more democratic in their ways of living together. And the central idea is that families are not going through processes of democratization, and they are not going enough through processes of being aware of their own violence. So I am really worried about that. And then the educational programs at universities in Mexico are very, very important in terms of help people in the communities to be aware of their own violence, and there are forms of resistance to gender norms, to gender rules, but in ways in which they cannot isolate from each other, but trying to get together the communities in ways in which they can struggle against rules, dominant rules, but in ways in which they can live together, and in ways in which they can recreate forms of love which are nutritional for them, forms of solidarity from women and men, and from girls and boys. And so all these questions within the violence in the family, we're seeing also the question of not listening to children, not listening to children's needs, not listening to children's desires. So the authoritarian ways are also related to the relationship between generations, not only between genders or among genders, but also between generations. So it's very important in these educational programs that we are working to try to put together the organization of families in order to listen to children, to be recognizing each other in the family organization, in order to see the needs and desires of each other. One of the questions that I want to put in discussion is the question of these programs are a mechanism to give resources to people to fight against authoritarianism. And violence comes from a heteronormative social system based on hierarchical binary relations of domination that cut across ethnic groups, social classes, and numerous gender identities and sexual orientations. Family is a cornerstone for the reproduction of patriarchal relations. That is why our work on violence prevention is based on the democratization of family relations. This approach is associated with the idea of the democratization of intimacy that comes from Anthony Giddens and by many feminist authors that propose the idea that personal affairs are political ones. Furthermore, the democratization of private and everyday life means the equal participation of family members in decisions and responsibilities according to age and vulnerabilities. Our pedagogy proposes not only the rejection of heterosexual rules, but also to build up new proposals for intersubjective encounters among diverse gender people inside the educational setting, which we call the workshop, el taller, a sort of training program to essay respectful bonds where we listen to each other, we have sympathy for differences in opinions and attitudes, and co-responsibilities for the care of children and each other among adults. This way of teaching is based on the personal training, on the personal discovery of their own subordination along life. Finally, people are subjects who are caring for their own life, and there are programs that are very based on only rational and mental questions. Normally, educational programs which comes from the government, they are usually they are programs who are related to rational questions, trying to understand what is violence. And we are trying, on the contrary, to understand, of course, but to understand violence, getting inside our own lives and reflecting through narrative reflections, we can be aware of how we suffer and we're victims of this violence, but without being aware, without having enough resources to fight, to resist against gender rules. Some of the diagnoses people were doing at that moment in the government and in the 90s were the problems that traditional family was breaking away, that women were not responsible of upbringing, and men were not having their clear position in the families, that everything was breaking apart. So really, we are realizing that that is not the problem. The feminist movement helped us to see really that since the beginning of the 21st century, there have been gender programs who are really looking for ways in which people accept all kinds of diversity of families. And diversity of families may be authoritarian or may be democratic. That is not the question. The question is how diverse families can deal with violence and can deal with the respect from each other, and to listen to each other, to recognize each other, especially among adults who are caring for children in the families. So when we are going through these educational programs, what we are doing, I'm not really reading because I think I have to explain some things without reading.
2 minutes left, please.
What?
2 minutes left, please.
Okay. Can you understand me? Can you listen to me?
Yes, you have 2 minutes left in your time.
Solo
Okay.
2 minutos, doctora.
Okay. So what I can tell you that this, I will tell you some final thoughts that I will read. Among women, the feminist movement, and among university women particularly, feminist theory was a great impulse to reflect about our life histories and the ways we were ignored, surrogated, silenced, and abused. Every moment of reflection showed us how gender mandates and heterosexual norms did not allow us to recognize our desires along our life. This is why we need university training and educational programs with the orientation of learning how to become subjects, co-constructing equal and co-responsible family and community relationships. It's a cultural aim of today's university programs to preserve emotional health and prevent violence in everyday life. Men have started today in this last decade to organize as men who are fighting against hegemonic ways of being men. So we can really rely on the possibility of working together as women and men, struggling against these gender rules and looking at ways in which we can, in some ways, look at ways in which we can work together, the new relationships based on nutritional ways of looking at each other, respecting each other, listening to each other. And this is the ways, I think the most important ways in which we are going through these educational programs, to give resources to people and to construct resources to live together in ways in which are peaceful and respectful. Well, I am sorry for my language problems to talk more quickly, but I hope you heard to me. You listened to me. Thank you so much for this invitation, and I hope we can communicate each other in many, many ways in which we can understand each other.
Yes, thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. We understood your talk very well.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Wanted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Yolanda Suarez-Balcazar. She's a Department of Occupational Therapy in the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present at this conference. A little bit about me. I was trained as a community psychologist, and my work is centered around understanding and addressing health disparities experienced by families of children and youth with disabilities, particularly Latinx families, and designing culturally relevant health promotion programs. The project that I'll be talking about today is sponsored by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Our team is called PODER, which basically translates to Promoting Obesity Prevention Among Latinx Children with Developmental Disabilities and their Families. Specifically, today I'll be talking about social determinants of health and mental health impacting the wealth and the well-being of caregivers of children with disabilities. I will refer to children with intellectual and developmental disabilities as children with IDD. An overview. In general, Latin families experience additional stress due to the demands associated with raising a child with a disability. Only until recently, people with disabilities have been considered a health disparities area that we need to pay attention to. Latin caregivers are more likely to not only care for a child with a disability, but also care for other children and older adults, and often older other extended relatives. And most of this responsibility often falls in the female caregivers of the home. We also know that there's a scarcity of research about Latina and Latino children with IDD and their families and their caregivers. It's often hard to recruit from the Latino Latina community, or often researchers are not bicultural, bilingual, or have protocols adapted to reach out to this community. we've been fortunate through this project that I'll be describing today, because we partner with our community organizations and support groups available to Latinx community. We also know, based on the little available literature, that children and youth with disabilities and their caregivers have a higher rate of health disparities issues. For instance, they have a higher rate of obesity compared to families without children with disabilities and compared with Latino families without children with disabilities. We also know that they're likely to experience disparities in an exacerbated way, little access to health providers that understand disability, that are bilingual and bicultural, and a large proportion of them are likely to lack insurance. So the aim of our grant is to strengthen this body of literature and develop and test interventions that address disparities in the Latino, Latina children with disabilities and their families. We ground our work on the social determinants of health model, but also want the phases of health disparities research. So most health disparities research starts with detecting. So what do we know? How do we define and measure disparities among the Latino Latina community with disabilities? Then we go into understanding. How do we understand, and what are those specific factors that impact the health and the well-being? And then we move into reducing. I'm going to share our R2, which means research study number 2, and some preliminary data, and then share with you how we're using that data to design a culturally relevant health promotion program to promote the well-being, the mental health well-being, the overall health of the caregiver and the family. In this study, we tried to identify the social determinants of health that impact the well-being of the caregiver, the health and obesity of this population. The conceptual framework that we are following, grounding our work, is the social determinants of health. It is important to look at social determinants because the heavy emphasis is on what are those environmental, community, or even policy issues that impact families. At the social determinants of health level, we are looking at neighborhood and built environment. We're looking at economic stability, education, social and community context, and health and healthcare access. We're also looking at a number of family and cultural factors, health behaviors, child factors as well, and all of them interact to impact the healthcare and the health of the caregiver and the child, from well-being to quality of life and so forth. So the aim of this study is to identify some of these factors. We are collecting data in Illinois and Texas, and I'm going to share data from 84 families, caregivers, female caregivers that have participated in 3 interviews. The data collection is done across 3 interviews by bilingual occupational therapists and other research assistants that we train, and we collect a number of measures and have the opportunity to engage with the caregiver. The caregiver gets a $25 gift certificate after each interview. And they also get a number of things at the end that I'm going to speak about in a little bit. So about our participants, 84 female caregivers, Latina caregivers, the average age 43, the majority have been born outside of the United States, 75% in Mexico. 58% reported a household income of less than $35,000 a year. And a household income, we might be talking about 4 to 6, even 8 people living under that income. Child mean age is 13 years of age, and 68% of the participants are male children. The majority have autism spectrum disorders. And let's look at some of the data compared with our non-Latino population. We also interviewed non-Latinos in Texas. Most of them are white families. We only have 82 for the non-Latino and 22 for the non-Latino and 84 for the Latino population. These are all families with children with intellectual and developmental disabilities between the ages of 6 and 17. Look at some of the differences. 58% of our 84 participants live in an income of $35,000 or less per family, while 9.1% of the non-Latino population. 28% of our Latino caregivers, Latina caregivers, report employment outside the home, compared with 73 of the non-Latina caregivers. And 85% of the Latina caregivers have been born outside the United States, compared with 10% for the non-Latina caregivers. I'm going to share some preliminary results about mental health and well-being. We're finding out that perceived social support and higher income and having access to financial benefits have been associated with less mental health symptoms. If families had at least one person they can count on for support, they had less or reported less health symptoms, mental health symptoms. Decrease in family income was significantly associated with depressive symptoms. And we saw that during the last couple of years throughout the pandemic. Those families that reported losing part of the family income reported more depressive symptoms. Several caregivers reported moderately high perceived social support from a significant other, and beneficial benefits were significantly associated with increases in perceived social support. So that's kind of an interesting relationship that we're beginning to see. The better off they were financially, the more likely they had larger social support networks. 36% of the caregivers, of the 84 caregivers, were at risk for depression. This is interesting and quite high, because if we look at the current literature found in a systematic review that in the general population, about 8.8% of the general population is at risk for depression. And 36% of our mothers reported risk factors for depression. The depression scores were negatively associated with the physical health, how they rated the physical health, the level of energy, family income, again, and whether the family received any financial benefits during the pandemic. Interesting relationship again. We thought, because a large percent of our families lost the therapeutic supports for the children, occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, during the last 2 years, that was going to be also associated with depression symptoms. And it was not associated with depression symptoms. We also found that first-generation immigrant status may be associated with lack of knowledge of financial and food resources and overall services in the community, feeling disenfranchised, disempowered to ask for support, and experiencing a lot of other barriers like having no insurance. Overall health and obesity, which is one of the aims of the grant, 33% of children met the criteria for obesity, which is higher than the national prevalence for Latinx children, which is 25.6%. Children and parents were older, unemployed, and had higher BMI, which is body mass index, a measure of obesity, had a higher percentile for obesity, for BMI. And children whose parents demonstrated greater use of controlling parental strategies, like having routines about screen time, rules, norms that they follow at home, had lower BMI percentile. And this is important because we know from the existing evidence that high obesity, high BMI is also associated with other health issues. Impact of COVID-19, we found that Latin families of children with IDD face unique challenges, not counting on the supports for the kids, therapeutic supports being interrupted, not knowing what to do with the children at home during the pandemic. Most families in this study were negatively impacted throughout the pandemic, which led them caregiver responsibilities worsen their health and the perception of mental health and well-being. As I said, many of the families lost the therapeutic supports. Some of the comments from the families: access to resources and settings for physical activity and exercise is an issue in their communities. Access to disability resources and supports, they don't know what those resources and supports might be and how to access them. Economic uncertainty, mental health and well-being. Many of the conversations that we have with the families through our community partners, repeatedly, they highlighted the lack of mental health counselors who know about disability and are bilingual and bicultural and able to provide mental health support. So I'm going to rush to the next couple of slides. Opportunities and benefits that they've seen in the last 2 years. They learn new skills, especially technology, like many of us did, enhance our technology skills. They experience a lot of family bonding. They experience more preparation of meals and activities together as a family and more time together. And they got to worry about moving into the non-pandemic phase, how to retain those benefits that they experience. So conclusions. 1 minute?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to go into conclusions and implications. Latin families of children with IDD face unique challenges. And many, if they are immigrants, don't know what resources are available to them. First generation immigrant status may be associated with knowledge, limited knowledge of resources, and limited sense of entitlement, right? Like they are afraid or hesitant to even ask at the school what resources or rights their child with a disability has. Most families in the study were negatively impacted by the pandemic, and a lot of the responsibilities fell into the families, the female caregiver. I'm going to go quickly into this last slide. For us, knowledge translation has been critical. We partner with community agencies, listen to the concerns of the families. I meet with them once a month through a support group called Grupo Salto. We share with them infographics, resources, personalized summaries of where they are in terms of the well-being, activity, the physical activity. We partner with communities, but also offer topics of interest to them. We've done conversations about well-being, healthy eating, physical activity, sexuality and disability, and occupational therapy services. Our next phase is that we will be completing 100 interviews and then designing a promotoras intervention where experienced mothers will be working one-on-one with Latina caregivers of children with disabilities, immigrant mothers, and how to promote their health and their well-being. And there's vast evidence indicating the power of using promotoras, relying on promotoras to support Latinx families and caregivers. So this is a photo of our Poder team, and thank you so much for inviting me to present.
Thank you for your presentation. My pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ana Fresán Orellana from the Clinical Research Directorate, Instituto Nacional de Psiquiatría, Ramón de la Fuente Muñez, Mexico. Thank you and welcome.
Hello. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I am deeply grateful for this invitation to this wonderful event. It's an honor for me to be here with you. First of all, I want to tell you that I am not used to speaking English. An apology for my mistakes during the presentation. I am a doctor in psychology and health from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and been working as a medical sciences researcher at the National Institute of Psychiatry almost for 25 years. I've been working on several lines of research. I first started with first episode psychosis. Then I'll go working on schizophrenia, outcome variables related to the curves and prognosis. And after several negative comments, I started studying stigma related to mental disorders and how aggression it was part of these stigmatizing attitudes and which factors may be related to its manifestation. And currently, I am working in the physical and mental health of physicians. Particularly, I'm going to talk to you about our research on Mexican psychiatrists. We know that all professions have adversities. Even when we are students, we live a lot of adversities that may cause stress and discomfort. As I told you, we are going to talk about doctors' health and their experiences, particularly what our psychiatrists live in their daily work life and how some experiences, personal and laboral experiences, may lead them to have suicide ideation during their professional activities. We know that any profession where an individual depends on another creates stress, and this is what our doctors live every day. They have continuous contact with human suffering. They hear or live situations of great pain, confusion, and drama linked to health, illness, and death throughout the entire professional career. There is a general idea that the doctors, due to their knowledge, due to their experiences, are aware of what they have to do to have a better health, and people assume they do it. People assume that all doctors have a wonderful quality of life, that all doctors take care of themselves. However, this is not entirely true. It is very difficult for doctors to take care of themselves. For example, they postpone their revisions or only attend to a revision when they feel really, really bad. When they can go to work, that's the moment when sometimes they attend to other specialists to see what's happening to their health. Also, they trivialize their symptoms, and they argue that they have no time for something that is really not that important. One of the most important and common mistakes is that they self-diagnose and self-medicate. Even if doctors are experts in the area, it is not adequate to do this, as they are not objective with their symptoms nor with their treatment. Also, doctors are surrounded by stigmatizing attitudes. And therefore, if a doctor gets sick, if a doctor has a mental disorder, if a doctor can't work because he or she has burnout, many people can translate this situation as they are weak. They are not capable because they have a mental disorder. They are inadequate to be a doctor. And sometimes our doctors reject evaluations in their workplace or even by other colleagues, which are often devaluated due to professional differences, quarrels, or even for considering that that colleague is not professionally enough to treat them. So we have several problems in this case. And one reality is that our doctors in Mexico are overloaded with work. Just to show you an example of this work overload, I want you to look at the next, this graphic. In this graphic, I am showing you the number of doctors we have in our country per 1,000 inhabitants, regardless if they have a medical specialty or not. As you can see, less than 5 doctors for 1,000 persons, which are unevenly distributed across the territory. And we must also consider that in addition to the lack of doctors, there are many health system deficiencies, shortcomings, bureaucracy, and other factors that may increase our doctors' overload. Talking about health promotion, sometimes seems to be easy. We know we have to have better and healthier eating and sleeping patterns. We know that we are supposed to be aware of what is happening to us and recognize if we have a problem. And in the educational and laboral institutions, there are a lot of courses and motivational talks to improve the environment. However, once again, the reality differs from these ideal situations. There are different circumstances that impedes to have a complete and fully functional health promotion program and behavior. In addition, we cannot forget that our doctors have their own life history. And if we add the personal history and these shortcomings, these situations may lead our doctors to develop mental disorders, physical diseases, or even to develop suicide ideation, suicide attempts, or even completed suicides. What's happening with our psychiatrists? I want to talk about psychiatrists because they live some particular situations in their professions that are very different from the situations that other specialty doctors live. And also they have some specific adversities to what is being to be a psychiatrist. For example, there is this general idea that society expects that psychiatrists need to have a good mental health, as they are the ones that care for the mentally ill. The general population difficultly believes that some of our psychiatrists may have a mental a mental health disorder and they consider that they are not adequate to be psychiatrists if they have a mental health disorder. Which are these situations or these particular situations that our psychiatrists live day to day? The first one is related to vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. The main work tools of psychiatrists are themselves, their minds, their thoughts, their emotions, and their ability to maintain objectivity without making any judgment about their patients. Our psychiatrists are frequently exposed to the most heartbreaking stories from their patients, including deaths, kidnapping, and torture, among others, that may have a deleterious impact on their own mental health, as they cannot express any emotion related to what our patient is telling us. They have to be supportive for the patient and do not express fear, fear, sadness, or anything that makes our patient close and not talk to us anymore. Our psychiatrists also are exposed to aggressive behaviors, particularly from patients. But we have to consider that many aggressive behaviors are related to psychiatric symptomatology and not related to what the person with this disorder is. And this is very difficult to understand. There are several factors that may lead to aggressive behavior and is not directly related to the disorder, to the diagnosis particularly. Other times, psychiatrists are attacked by patients' relatives, and we cannot rule out that many of them were assaulted during the residency by senior doctors or residents of higher rank, situation that for years has been normalized and until recently an open theme to be attended. Violence to doctors starts when they start their studies in medicine. Also, our psychiatrists have to face suicide or severe suicide ideation of the patients under their care. It is not uncommon for psychiatrists to feel responsible for this serious situation, despite having adequately performed as psychiatrists, despite having given the adequate treatment, the adequate attention, they feel responsible. Also, in many cases, the only human contact a psychiatrist has during the day is with the patients. Considering confidentiality between psychiatry and the patient, the first one cannot share any information related to the patient. Therefore, if after a working day, the psychiatrist goes with his or her family, many things that may have affected emotions or thoughts cannot be shared. And the psychiatrist has to live with these emotions alone. This is not easy. As psychiatrists, although they have company, although they have a family, although they have friends, they may feel lonely or with lack of social support. And well, I just want to use some of the images I found in the internet about discrimination against mental health disorders, psychiatry, and psychiatrists. For example, psychiatry was one of the last medical specialties to be accepted as such in the scientific community. On the other hand, many mental disorders are considered to be a fraud. Many persons think that mental disorders do not exist and that psychiatrists are sexual aggressors, sexual abusers, or that they only drug people. As mental disorders do not exist, there is no need for treatment. And this is something that happened a few years ago in the World Congress of Psychiatry in Mexico City, We have an anti-psychiatry movement around the world, and Mexico is not the exception. You can see these enormous signs that were outside the Congress. The first one said, "Do not mess with my children. Psychiatry kills. Electroshock treatment does not cure. It is torture." And also almost 200 persons were impeding the entrance to the Congress. For all the persons we want to attend to the conferences where we were talking about how to improve treatment, how to improve human contact with the persons affected with a mental disorder. And this is also what other doctors talk about psychiatry. My friend, believe me that less than 1% of the generation wants to be a psychiatrist. You are the homeopath of specialties, so anything but pity. I think a family doctor has a better reputation. As you can see, although we have a lot of scientific information in the internet, this information is accessible to the general population. And also the movies, the TV, doesn't help to avoid this inadequate perception of psychiatrists and psychiatry in the world. Therefore, we want to identify the associated factors to suicide ideation in Mexican psychiatrists. We want to identify if there were some professional factors that were related to the presence of suicide ideation, or if suicide ideation was related to factors previously reported in the general population. For this, we invited psychiatrists around the country who were willing and able to participate through an online survey. This survey was performed in 2018, before the COVID pandemic. And the online survey includes the assessment of several variables. First of all, demographics and working activities, self-reported mental health, such as the presence of depression, anxiety, burnout, and if our psychiatrists received treatment at the time they had these affections. Also, we evaluate professional adversities and social support using the social support questionnaire, and perceived discrimination was assessed with the internalized stigma scale.
I have 2 minutes left, please.
Yes. This is some demographic information. As you can see, most of our participants were married or partnered. They work on consultation or teaching and work approximately 13 hours a day. And in our country, it is supposed that we have to work 8 hours as a maximum. 7.6% of our psychiatrists report suicide ideation. And when we compare this with a general population survey called ENCODAT, you can see that the difference is enormous, almost 3 times higher than the general population. We then compare all the variables we assess in psychiatrists with and without suicidal ideation, and we found that those with suicide ideation were younger, were less frequently married, when a less percentage have children, and they do not have another physician in the family. Also, the prevalence of depression, anxiety, and burnout was astonishing compared to those without suicidal ideation. And they also perceive more discrimination and have lower social support. All these variables were included in a logistic regression model, and we found that being married, having another physician in the family, and having more satisfaction with social support protects our psychiatrists of having suicide ideation, while depression and burnout increase the risk of having suicide ideation. What can we conclude? Do psychiatrists need to ask for help? Self-recognition is not enough to avoid or reduce suicide ideation if present. Other important factors related to educational and working institutions should be implemented, not leaving all the responsibility to psychiatrists who may not be aware of the negative impact of their experiences they're having. Also, many times we as humans are not totally aware of these alarm signs until it is too late. Stigma and internalized stigma should be eliminated. Psychiatrists are human, and as humans, they also have personal problems, including separations, divorces, the death of loved ones, economic problems, etc. They are not immune to sickness or depression, so we should stop romanticizing that psychiatrists or any doctor are perfect. If one of our mental colleagues, if one of our friends, colleagues, etc., is having a rough time, we should not be indifferent and move away from the person. This person needs human contact, empathy, and understanding. We can be the person that helps this human being to seek for professional help, giving the social support that at that time is more than necessary. Finally, let me introduce you to this wonderful teamwork. 3 mental health professionals in pictures not related to their professions, nor in academic forums. I want to show you the most bright side of them as human beings. And finally, thank you to all the psychiatrists that made this research possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that very insightful talk. I wanted to just reiterate a message that was sent to, if you have any questions for our speakers, can you please direct them to the chat? Thank you again, Dr. Fresán. And I want to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Roberto Lopez-Tamayo from the Department of Clinical Psychiatry in the Urban Youth Trauma Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago.
We cannot hear you.
Okay, now, so I apologize for that. So let me ensure that. Okay.
I have your slides if you want me to share them.
Are you able to, hold on.
I can share you.
Now, are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I apologize for the technical difficulties. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I work at the Pediatric Stress and Anxiety Disorders Clinic here at the Institute for Juvenile Research. And so as an immigrant, I'm very interested in, oh, this is playing tricks on me now. So I'm very interested in developing programs for Latinos. Today, I'm going to present on the development and implementation of a trauma-informed caregiver curriculum for Latina Latino parents. And little bit about the background. And as a clinical community psychologist, I see the individual within the context, and as Dr. Yolanda Suarez-Balcazar and also other presenters have discussed the social determinants of health affecting Latino communities. I just want to say very quickly that these social determinants are conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And for Latinos, for a good percentage of Latinos, poverty and social exclusion due to structural racism and discriminatory policies are affecting individuals in different ways, in different aspects, whether it's gender, education, occupation, income, employment, access to health services and community resources. But also for Latinos, they also face differences in terms of national origin, whether someone is either from Mexico or from Argentina or from Cuba, they have a different story. Generational status in the US, whether they are immigrants or US born, immigration status, whether they are documented or undocumented, their levels of acculturation and language. So all this goes into how they grow and they experience like the different factors. And let's not forget about the COVID-19 pandemic and how this, through a range of all these factors, exacerbating like problems for the Latino communities. So what we know is that unfortunately Latinos, especially young Latinos, they tend to be 4 times more likely not to complete high school, and also they are twice as likely to live below the poverty line, live in multi-generational households, and work in essential jobs, and have difficulties accessing healthcare, and due to language barriers or for not having insurance. But also, it is important to recognize Latinos as a heterogeneous group, and that many times research tend to generalize findings, and it is important to look at the different contextual and individual factors affecting subgroups of Latinos so that we can work with community members and stakeholders in developing and disseminating culturally grounded prevention and intervention curriculum for this population. And child maltreatment, especially, is on the rise. The rates have increased in the last years, almost 20%, with almost 8 million children living in the US reporting being victims of alleged abuse or neglect. So we know that with the pandemic, with the shelter in place and other restrictions, people who are living in, spending most of the time in their houses. In the case of Latinos living in multi-generational houses, being exposed to other factors such as financial strain and also dealing with other stressors that exacerbated also problems in the household. And we see that some of these incidents reported to Child and Protective Services were largely perpetrated by parents or caregivers. But interestingly, only 1 in 4 violence incidents against youth were reported to the police. And also we see study support and show the association between being unemployed or financial strain and maltreatment. In this case, we see that children whose parents were unemployed had about twice the rate of child abuse and 2 to 3 times the rate of neglect than children with employed parents. So this cycle of violence keeps perpetrating as children are exposed to violence in the household. That leads to endorsement of externalizing behavior, particularly violent behavior in the short and long-term goal, in long term. And let's take a step back. And parents and caregivers, they influence the cultural and community characteristics, and they shape the environment and conditions where children develop. But not only these experiences affect the developing brain, but also their body systems, including metabolic regulation and emotional regulation. So experiences of adversity and trauma in the context of systemic racism or discrimination, intergenerational poverty, or social inequity may increase stress that lead to parental burnout, impacting or affecting parents' ability to promote a safe and nurturing environment for their children. So many of you may relate to this, but especially those who are parents, they might feel emotionally drained, become less emotionally available for their children, and then have a sense of parental ineffectiveness. So that might lead to like poor parenting skills and putting children or making children more exposed to aggressiveness and violence in the household. So reducing toxic stress among Latino caregivers by promoting trauma-informed coping strategies and a safe, nurturing environment may help reduce violence in the household. And what we see is that the current violence prevention interventions fall short in addressing this violent behavior in the home, since most of the programs are focusing on youth, and also they're focusing on risky behaviors, domestic violence, but with little emphasis on parenting skills using a trauma lens. Especially what we also want to emphasize is helping parents to become a change agent so that they know that they can make a change in their family and also community by learning and putting into practice this trauma-informed coping and social supports. And the theoretical framework that we use for this curriculum is using this socio-ecological framework for violence prevention. That is, many of you perhaps know Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological approach. So we are looking at different levels of factors that are that interplay and affect individuals. But also we are using the theory of planned behavior, which is guided by these three ideas, these beliefs about the likely consequences of the behavior or behavioral beliefs, but also normative beliefs. So the expectations of that others have about that behavior, and also the beliefs about how you can actually engage in that behavior. So what we want to see is, we're going to show you the conceptual model in a minute, but for the implementation, we want to also endorse this participatory action research, which is basically like bringing together researchers and participants, community participants, stakeholders, to understand and collaborate community issues and take actions to bring about social change. And also this component called CETA, which is Common Elements Treatment Approach, which is a transdiagnostic model using common cognitive behavioral therapy skills in psychoeducation. So training in this model provides lay people with the skills to address a number of concerns without needing to have intensive training, and also with the ability to target behaviors without needing more sophisticated knowledge of diagnosis and co-occurring conditions. And so what we propose with this curriculum is, so we are aiming at changing the self-efficacy or self-agency or perceived behavioral control of parents so that they change their attitudes toward maltreatment, and in turn, they become more likely to engage in that behavior. So this is just also to show a little bit about this curriculum. The target population will be Latino caregivers, immigrants and US born, children between 6 and 17, parents who have children between 6 or 17. And why not 0 to 5? Because another colleague of mine from the Urban Youth Trauma Center is developing a very specific curriculum for parents of children between ages 0 to 5. And also because it's more, I think it will be more specific for early childhood, develop a more specific curriculum. And we are proposing a randomized block design in which we are in the process of engaging community-based organizations in Chicago, and also we are in talks with some Chicago public schools to deliver the intervention. And for the first arm, we will pair one clinician and one lay person. For the arm 2, we will put actually 2 lay person co-facilitating the group. And in the arm 3, we will also look at the UIC clinic, the Pediatric and Stress and Anxiety Disorders Clinic. We will select 2 providers to facilitate each of the caregiver group. And this, some of the specific about this is 8 sessions, 60-minute long, and around approximately 10 caregivers participating in groups to receive training at participating community-based organizations or public schools. And at the end of each session, participants will generate ideas for an action plan aimed at enhancing climate and supporting caregiver engagement consistent with the violence prevention principles. So it's not only receiving information, but also if the focus of this training also is to enhance or to increase self-efficacy. So we want them to start practicing that by coming up with plans, individual plans, how they are going to change, use that information to implement it in their family during that week. And at the end, group facilitators will engage caregiver participants in an additional action planning session to coordinate the implementation of family and community-wide initiatives stemming from ideas generated within the initial group sessions. So we want to come up with a community action plan in which they feel that, in which they can propose something that they want to change within their communities. And this is based on these 5 best practices of community violence and trauma informed. Number 1 is identifying and supporting victims of trauma and violence. 2 is developing life skills in children and adolescents. Also developing safe, stable, and nurturing relationships between children and their parents and caregivers. 4 is promoting a safe environment in the community. And 5 is changing rules and expectations in society. So it's looking at the individual, family, community, society, and also changing rules. The curriculum goals are building awareness about violence prevention, resilience and protective factors, and also provide opportunities for mastery and competence by learning and applying positive coping skills, and facilitate caregiver engagement and contribution in positive social climates through social service learning in school and community settings, and support caregiver involvement in maintaining a healthy social environment that promotes positive activities, healthy relationships, positive norms, access to services, safe spaces, and culturally responsive context. And so the sessions are, these are the title of the sessions, getting to know you and your community. So it's learning about those contextual factors or also individual factors in relation to their acculturation journey and other characteristics. Then we will move on to discuss every single best practice. Practice number 1, know the signs of adverse childhood experiences and trauma. 2, develop a sense of trust, develop a sense of mastery. But we also include one chapter or one session to discuss somatic interventions. As we know, Latinos, or even in Latin America too, we tend to somaticize things. So many times stress can, get somaticized, and they go to the doctor to deal with headache or stomachache or other physical symptoms, but they don't make the connection sometimes to being stressed out, anxious, or other diagnoses. So it's important to also discuss these connections so that they can also take care of themselves and develop a sense of safety, change the message, which is important. The whole message against violence and to stop glorifying violence. And the last one is putting it together. So it's a recap of all these best practices and how we can come up with a community action plan. And these are just some of the examples taken from the curriculum. We see why violence happens, and we see that we see it at the individual, relationship, community, and societal levels. It's very important for us to be very specific about every single setting and how that relates to the best practices, what we can do about it. So it's not only acknowledging, but also what they can do within their own house, family, and using the resources at their disposal. Also, the levels of impact.
Dr. Lopez-Tamayo, 2 minutes to conclude the presentation, please. Thank you.
Thanks. So, not everybody is impacted by trauma in the same way. As many of the presenters discuss, something that is traumatic for one child is not necessarily traumatic for the other. And the impact of trauma might depend on many things, including the objective nature of the event, what actually happened, also the subjective response, how you reacted to what happened, and the person's age and developmental stage, the perception of the danger faced, whether the person was a victim or a witness, and also the person's past experience with trauma, and the person's relationship to the victim or the perpetrator, and the other adversities that the child faces following the trauma, and how the child has been helped by caregivers and trusting adults. So this is also something that we discuss in part of the sessions, how trauma affect youth in different aspects, trouble in relationships, problem controlling emotions and behavior, problems with learning, memory, and attention, the way that they think about themselves in the future, behavioral issues, long-term problems. Also, we have activities, very hands-on activities where they can see at different levels, what are the challenges that they and their family face, and what are the strengths that they have And we offer examples. Also, what are the signs that they can see or what they observe how the child might be struggling in different areas. Same thing, we offer examples. And to change the message is easy how we come up with, these ideas about we glorify, we justify violence, or even violent behaviors in the household. So how we can change the message, we need to start thinking about whether we agree or disagree with these and how also other factors shape these beliefs. So, sorry, it's been a lot of information, I know, cramped in very few slides. Apologize for the technical difficulties, but so any questions, I will be able also to address it at the Q&A. My information is here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez-Tamayo, for an interesting presentation. I'm Jose Andino. I'm from the chemistry department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and I will be your moderator for the rest of the symposium. And I will go ahead and introduce our next presenter. Our next presenter is Dr. Luz Maria Garcini. Dr. Garcini is an assistant professor at the Center for Research to Advance Community Health at the University of Texas Health Science Center, San Antonio, Joe R. and Teresa Lozano Long School of Medicine, and a faculty scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. The title of her presentation is Mental Health in the Latino Latina Community. Dr. Garcini, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you for this fantastic event, very much needed and very timely. We know that our Latino communities, there were existing gaps before the pandemic, and the pandemic just had made them wider. So I think this is something that is absolutely at the top of the American Psychological Association agenda of something that needs to be addressed. We have a pressing need. We have many, many needs in terms of how we're going to go about doing this. But forums like this are very important to keep us informed and to keep us connected. So I want to thank Dr. Lopez-Tamayo for putting up this curriculum. First of all, for mentioning the social determinants of health. I think when we try to address the mental health needs of our Latino communities, the social determinants of health provide a wonderful framework to think about all of the different things that we need to address when talking about mental health. Sometimes, yes, we might be psychologists, public health professionals, social workers, and we need to wear many hats if we are going to adequately and effectively address the mental health of our communities. I also appreciate the efforts to develop interventions. We know, we talk all the time about the importance of culturally and contextually adapted interventions, but we really haven't spent much time to see what are those things that might make a difference in our community. And Dr. Lopez-Tamayo just gave us a beautiful example as to how in a few sessions, we can actually address this issue. So I will be elaborating a little bit on some of the recent data that I collected on my work throughout South Texas, but primarily in communities that are historically marginalized and near the US-Mexico border through the lens of community health workers who are trusted members of our communities. These are just some disclosures about my work. I want to be mindful of the time. And I'm going to very briefly give you a little bit of background on significant. I'm pretty sure that most of us in the Zoom meeting today understand what our communities have been through over the past 5 years, if not more. And then some of the research findings as to what are some of the primary stressors reported by these communities during the context of COVID-19, and then a call to action. What do we need to do in terms of research, our clinical work, and most importantly, how each of us has an opportunity to take action in terms of policy, how we can go about doing this. So what is happening? We know that a lot of these historically underrepresented communities have a lot, it's an immigrant community in many different ways. Some of them have been here longer than others. Some are recently arriving, but the rhetoric that we've been hearing affects everybody, affects those that have been here, affects those who are recently arrived. It's a very heterogeneous community with different issues, different problems. But regardless, we tend to all be lumped into this group that unfortunately have experienced high stigmatization, but is feeling like it's being left out of the discrimination discourse. And this is something that I continuously hear from the community, which is creating a lot of stress. We know that these communities are experiencing high socioeconomic vulnerability, and the longer time that these communities or these families stay embedded in the United States, the worse their health outcomes become. We also know that access to health, social, and legal services is limited. So we need to think about how we go and reinvent the wheel to make these services available to them. We know that there is a high prevalence of trauma and marginalization as well, and that there is limited information, that a lot of the times these families are navigating systems on their own and fall prey often of financial scams or false sources of information of needs. I mean, we heard all sorts of things throughout the COVID pandemic in terms of how people were coping. Yet, we know that our communities are resilient. We have heard about the immigrant resilience paradox that emphasizes that despite experiencing a high amount of disadvantage, they come afloat and they make it work. So the study that I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to highlight that aspect because I think one of the things that we need to think about is intervention for these communities is how can we empower them? How can we help them tap into those sources of resilience so that we can continue to move them forward? Ideally, our goal is to change the climate and create safe environments, but we have such a pressing need to do this faster. So even when the climate might not change, how can we give them the tools to deal with this situation and with these conditions of hardship that they're facing? And so Proyecto Voces is a line of research that I started back when I was in graduate school around 10 years ago, and it has changed through different phases, but it was aimed at informing the mental health, the health needs, because eventually it translated into physical needs as well, of underrepresented immigrant communities. And I work a lot primarily with undocumented and mixed status families. So this is one more arm of those studies. And this is the findings that I'm going to describe to you today have been published in this issue on health and social care for the community. But the goal was to just identify the stressors and the coping strategies that these communities have used to deal with COVID-19. And to develop clinical strategies to address their needs. You know, I learned once from one of the leaders in the community that says people come and tells us all the time, well, what are your needs? And we are overwhelmed by needs because when you have very little, everything becomes a need. But the right question to ask us is, what are your priorities? And a lot of the time, I think sometimes as investigators, as providers, we forget to ask them, what is in the midst of all of those needs that you have, what is your top priority? What do we need to address? So hopefully some of the results that I'll present to you will show you what are some of these priorities. So I conducted this study among community health workers, which are lay health providers in the community, and why I went to them. Our communities were very stressed of having more people going to ask them directly. Yet our community health workers have been the trusted providers for them in the midst of this pandemic. So I collaborated with several CHWs organization across South Texas, and they provided me the links. But interestingly, what we saw is that the toll was not only on the community, but also on these providers that were tending to the needs, and they were not have means to address their own health issues. And to this, I use mixed methods. So I use service and focus group, which I think is important for us to keep in mind that everything that we do, we not only find, sometimes we get enmeshed into our numbers and trying to find our statistics and associations, and we forget about trying to understand the why, about hearing the voices of our communities to try to understand this story. And this is why it's the importance of following up in every effort that we do, in every intervention that we do, following up with them and says, how did it work for you? What else can we do? How can we make it better so that their voices matter? And these are the stressors, almost in order of what our community identify are their primary needs. And above top was the economic losses. The financial toll in these communities have been tremendous. So when we start talking about mental health and how to take care of your health and all those issues, we need to go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't have food and shelter, all of the other things are not going to matter. So sometimes we need to start thinking and making sure that food security is one of their primary needs. What can we do as mental health professionals, as doctors, as social workers to address those needs, to advocate for those needs? Their jobs are important because not only to put food on the table, but this is a love of language. This is the love of language in our families to convey to our families, I'm fighting for you. I'm fighting for your survival. So how can we have that into account? Immigration legal status was also at the top of the hierarchy. There's tremendous amount of fear and distrust in these communities. The fear of family separation kept many families from going forward through vaccination, to testing, through all of these efforts that were primary strategies to prevent them from getting sick. But the anti-immigrant rhetoric and actions that we have seen have terrified our community. Misinformation. You know, people talk about telehealth and about all of this dissemination of health information. It's very difficult for a lot of these communities to have access to them. Often they share one computer among many people. But not only that, it's trusting it. They don't trust the systems. You can come as an investigator who have been working for them for a long time with a computer, and they still say, can you please not use a computer? Because they're afraid of what could happen. So it's important that we have that in mind. And their family, the changes in the family environment, in the family dynamics. And a big one that they were bringing up is the intergenerational conflict of how they go about navigating difficult family dynamics. So for instance, we have a lot of, in the middle, if you recall correctly, we saw the possible termination of the DACA program in the midst of the pandemic. And we talked to a lot of DACA recipients who were saying, well, my studies are important. I want to keep going, but my family doesn't understand. My family wants me to pull out of school and start contributing to the financial cost because at the end of the road, it's not going to matter. We're all going to be deported. And that led to a lot of internal family conflict that was very painful and that have not been resolved or talked about. We also saw a lot of changes in the roles. Children being cultural brokers for parents who did not speak English, for parents who did not know how to use technology, and they were busy taking 2-3 jobs to provide at the table. And this took a toll on the younger generations who had to also reinvent themselves and how to navigate the school systems, often when they did not have access to computers. Then we had the health-related needs, and then the social isolation. A lot of these communities rely on those informal gatherings, on going to visit with a neighbor to cope, on going to the church gatherings. When these went away, when these became interrupted, it created a big disruption in the mental health of our communities. So this is just a list of the so many things that came about in terms of what happened as a result of those stressors. We saw higher levels of depression and loneliness, anxiety, nervios, despair, hostility, irritability, obsessions. People became obsessed about not only cleaning, but about their work. They started putting so many hours together. That was another form of dealing with the distress. Dr. Lopez-Tamayo rightfully talked about somatization. They started having all of these symptoms that were not explained by physical conditions. Changes in health behaviors, diminished lack of sleep and eating patterns. And it's important when we talk about interventions that we talk also about lifestyle and health behaviors, because these communities work a lot. And if they're not rested, if they're not eating right, their health is going to be affected in addition to their mental health. Diminished self-care. And the rhetoric caused a lot of damage in terms of the sense of self-identity, in terms of the sense of meaning and purpose, a lot of feelings of guilt and shame. And we saw, unfortunately, rise in the interpersonal violence and substance use that the families were experiencing. Yet, as I mentioned, there were a lot of wonderful things that emerged in terms of coping strategies. This is a resilient community, and they came up with behavioral, cognitive strategies, social support, spirituality and religiosity is at the core of what our communities use to cope. And then efforts to enroll in advocacy, primary among the young adults. So just to give you an idea, and I can make the slides available for you. For the sake of time, I won't go over all of them, but I can give you some examples about some of the strategies that were identified. And it was behavioral activation. As I say, they became busy bees. What can I do next? How can I keep busier in doing it? Because it helped them not to sit down and think about the difficult situations. They started asking themselves about the mind and body exercises. So I was very happy that Dr. Lopez-Tamayo also put a session on that, because they were asking about it. How can I relax my body when I feel so tense? And they started making those connections on their own. They started talking about mindfulness, about being able to be in the moment without being consumed about what's coming. So they talk about taking walks with the family and start paying attention to what was around them, to just sitting down at the family dinner and looking at themselves. Also, stimulus control, the ability to reestablish their routines. It was so important to them to fight for how can they keep a schedule even in the midst of chaos. And in these, grandparents became essential in helping. When the parents had to go to work, the grandparents stepped to the plate and helped families keep up with their routines and the schedules. And then becoming informed. This was kind of like a mix of frustration, but then also motivated to people to start realizing the importance of learning English, the importance of learning to use technology, the importance of saving money so that they can get even one electronic device that could get them access to the information. In terms of cognitive strategies, I have to say the one that stick most to me was the importance of counting their blessings. Every day, no matter what, they try to focus on what's the good and try to ignore what's the bad. Try to normalize, tries to see, well, we're all in this together. And then using a collectivistic approach that I am not alone in this. I know my neighbor across the street. I know my family. I just spoke to them in the phone. We're all going through this. And in that, I have comfort. In the validation, affirming themselves that through spirituality, that something better will come. And having that, they have a strong source of trust and confidence in God. So this is why it is also important for us as health providers to work with faith-based organizations if we're going to make change. Walk hand in hand by the faith-based leaders, by their pastors, by their priests, but all of these people that they trust so that we can get our knowledge to them in the way that they can feel they can trust it. And then it is important also to devise support networks.
Dr. Garcini, sorry, just 2 minutes to conclude the presentation.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you a brief summary in terms of what we need now. In terms of our research, we need to refine our methods and our measures and how we go about. I talk about mixed methods at the beginning of my talk. We need to change the rhetoric to talk about how can we continue to build resilience. So the question should be not what's wrong with us, but how come, even in the midst of all of these challenging conditions, our communities continue to do so well? We need to continue working on intervention at all across the spectrum of development, implementation, dissemination, and sustainability. We need to build interdisciplinary collaborations across disciplines, and we need to build a research infrastructure and a workforce. In terms of clinical needs, the most pressing one is that we need to build a workforce. We don't have it. We recently passed guidelines, which are going to be published next month in the Journal of Latinx Psychology for immigration evaluations. We didn't even have that before. So we need to start pushing and advocating for the need of training that can specifically be tailored to address the need of our people, and for trauma-informed systems of care. For anyone that comes into contact with these communities to be informed in how the delivery of trauma interventions. And then advocacy of policy, and I'm going to close with this one. I think we all have a platform. Sometimes we think that we need to be in DC or reach out to make an impact on policy. And we forget that policy gets done even in our own institutions, even in our own houses, in how we advocate for these communities, in how we educate others through our research about these communities. That is how we can make policy. So think about what are some of the platforms that you can use to create safe environments, to stop the immigration rhetoric that has been so damaging to our communities, and to facilitate access to services and resources in a way that is affordable, accessible, and of quality. So I'm going to skip there. But as closing, our current context is putting our marginalized Latino communities at risk. And we know that there's a need for research, clinical, and policy efforts. So we need our communities, and our community needs us as professionals. So how can we work together to change what has happened, to change the systems and how we work to make this available to them? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcini, for a great presentation. And as we continue, I will introduce our next presenter, Dr. Pamela Garbus, who is a researcher, professor at the Department of Psychology, Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro, Mexico. The title of the presentation is Mental Health in Mexican Adolescents. Dr. Garbus, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the mental health of adolescents in Mexico. I will share my first of all, I will say sorry about my English. I will do my best. Well, about mental health in Mexico, we have that the mental disorder have much early onset age than in other countries. For example, in the years 2013, 2018, 24.7% of adolescent population was affected by one or more mental health conditions, depressions being one of the main ones. The suicide rate in Mexico has been increasing and is associated with an increase in social unrest. 40.2% of suicide cases were treated in young people between 15 and 29 years age. The rate in these populations being 7.9 suicide per 100 young people. The figures of alcohol consumption in Mexico are on rise too. Alcohol is responsible for 6.5% of premature death and 1.5% of days living poor health. 41.9% of boys and 39.4% of girls in high school have consumed alcohol sometimes in their lives. And the percentage of high school students who have drunk excessively was 14.5%. Notably, in primary school, about 17% of the student population reported having tasted alcohol, and 2.4% of these students reporting heavy drinking. Despite the seriousness of the mental health situation of children and adolescents, there are few studies of the prevalence of this problem that aim to have a social impact in Mexico. Now, I am going to share with you some of the findings of an epidemiological investigation carried out in 2 municipalities in the state of Querétaro, Mexico. We thought that there is a close relationship between mental health problems and condition of social vulnerability. Mental disorders produce big costs to the families. Conditions of poverty, violence, and lack of opportunity during childhood and adolescence increase the probability of developing this type of disorder. This is very important to know because in Mexico, 1 in 2 children and adolescents live in poverty. And of these, 20% are in extreme poverty. About the research, it was a cross-sectional epidemiological observational study. The aim was to describe the prevalence of depressive symptomatology, suicide ideation and attempt, and drug use in public high school students in 2 municipalities in this state of Querétaro. We thought to determine whether certain psychological and psychosocial factors such as self-esteem, locus of control, impulsivity, coping response to family stress, and everyday social stress, the relations of the adolescent with his or her father and mother, and support researches and social demographic data will be will have predictive relationship with the mental health variables that we investigated. The participation was voluntary. We have the parental permission and the consent of each participant. We use a self-administered questionnaire consisting in different standardized and validated scales for Mexican populations. The results were stratified by the reference to the deprivation of the area in which the school was located. I will share with you just the main results. We have a lot of data that because of the time we have to expose, I will share the most important, not just the psychological or psychosocial variables, but the main variables that we were studying. This was the sample, that's about the sample 41.1 were men, for the 58.9 were women, and this is the distributions about the grade. 36 were in first grade, 31.1 in second grade, and 32.5% was in third grade. This is the distribution about the level of marginalization of about the school that they were studied. It's important to know that when we say high level of marginalization, we mean that has a lot of lack of opportunity. And when we talk about low level of marginalization, we are talking about the school that has a lot of opportunities and resources and yes, opportunities. These are the three kind of schools. These ones, secundaria and general school, are the biggest ones. Excuse me, technical and general are the biggest one. And telesecundaria is just something about rural school, and they are smaller with one teacher per the group, and has a lot of communication and better relationships. That's what the study showed us. Okay. About the drug use, the prevalence of drug use in the path mouse was one of the variability that we studied. As you can see, alcohol and tobacco are the drugs most commonly used in the last month. 1.4% consumed 3 or more drugs in the last month. We studied too the prevalence of drug use once in a lifetime, and we found that 3.4% have used more than 3 different drugs in a lifetime, and 63.3% have used at least one drug in their lifetime. This is the age of first overall use. As you can see, the age is short. They are too young when they start using this kind of drugs. About prevalence of depressive symptomatology, we find that the recent elevated depressive symptomatology the rate was 15.9%. This was the population that has symptomatology of recent elevated depressive, and without this kind of symptomatology was this 84.1. This is the distribution about the grade, and as you can see, the difference is significant. So as they are in third grade, they have more recent elevated depressive symptomatology. And this is a significant difference too between the type of school. And we have that the school that are biggest, general and technical has more prevalence of this kind of symptomatology. Well, this is the kind of the prevalence present elevated depressive symptomatology by the level of marginalization, and here we have a significant difference between the level of marginalization and this high depressive symptomatology. As we can see, this one who are students in a school with lower level of marginalization has more elevated depressive symptomatology. Okay. This is the difference between men and women. This difference is significant too, and we did a cutoff point different for women and for men. And as you can see, women has a bigger rate of elevated depressive symptomatology. About suicidal behavior prevalence. Okay, we studied this. When we say suicidal ideation and behavior, we mean recent suicidal ideation, current suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior once in a life. This is the prevalence of recent suicidal ideation. As you can see, women, again, has a bigger rate than men. And the difference is significant too. And as you can see, about the prevalence of current suicidal ideation, women too has more symptomatology than men, and the difference is significant too. We studied too the prevalence of suicidal behavior once in a lifetime, and as you can see, the difference is bigger in women again, and is bigger in, about the others variables. The difference is too significant. I will share with you a few of conclusions just to think about it. Mexico is a middle-income country with high inequality. It's also a country with high prevalence rates of mental health problems with an increasingly early onset. The results of this study reflects the situation of adolescent mental health in the region, but are also consistent with national and Latin American statistics. Women presented a higher prevalence of depressive symptomatology and suicidal behavior. This has been a strong trend for many years, but the gap seems to be widening. It is important to say that women has higher rate of daily social stress, and we found a relation between daily social stress, depressive symptomatology, and suicidal behavior. It's extremely necessary encouraging more studies in adolescent mental health. Epidemiological research with a locus focal in adverse contexts should be a priority for researchers, founders, and decisions makers. Excuse me. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry again for my speaking English.
Dr. Garbus, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and needless to say, your English is perfect.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes. Our next presenter today is Ms. Daissy Dominguez. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Just give me.
Sorry. I'm just quickly gonna say your affiliation. I apologize. lost my screen. Oh, it keeps going. Okay. Actually, let's not delay. And since you have that on the first slide, let's defer to you. Thank you so much, Ms. Dominguez. The screen is yours.
No problem. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm attorney Daissy Dominguez. I primarily focus on immigration law. I've been practicing for about 9 years. I graduated from U of I back in 2010 and then went straight into law school, graduated in 2013. And shortly after graduating law school, started my own law firm. I started the practice through a program called the Justice Entrepreneurs Project that is dedicated to serving low and moderate income communities and trying to make our legal services more accessible to communities, because what the legal community was finding was that there was just too many individuals that were going to court pro se on their own, not having the financial means to hire an attorney. Attorneys in private practice were just charging too much by the hour, and then legal aid organizations were just not having enough resources. So we had a middle group of individuals without legal support. So they created the JEP program to help attorneys such as myself be able to launch our own firms, but with the mission of serving low and moderate income communities and trying to figure out ways of how can we reduce the workload, incorporate the client into the process to reduce our fees, and also not charge by the hour, and instead try to focus on other creative ways of doing flat fees or unbundling or different things. And so I was really excited about the opportunity to start my own practice with this mission, because I always wanted to serve low and moderate income communities. And in my mind, I thought the only way to do that was working through legal aid. And because of this program, I was able to kind of build a practice that is similar to legal aid, but within the private sector, and try to change the private practice into realizing that we can be more financially accessible while still sustaining our firms. So for the past 9 years, I've been mainly focusing on immigration cases. What I'm going to be discussing today is going to be helping you guys try to understand what is the legal process and how, understanding that process, can we use that information to try to advocate for social justice within the Latino Latina community. Okay. Now I apologize if my voice gets a little bad. On Tuesday, I was working the elections from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. answering calls every minute. And so I started to losing my voice yesterday, and luckily I'm able to speak a little bit more today. So I hope that doesn't cause me a problem, but so far I'm feeling pretty good right now. Now, quick disclosure. All the information that I'm providing here, it is just a brief summary, like a very, very brief summary of what is our immigration system. And it's not meant for anyone to be able to use this information to be able to provide legal information to any immigrant. We always recommend that you always refer any individual to a licensed attorney who can address those specific questions. And I'm just simply giving you a brief overview about our process. So let's start with the immigration system. It's important to understand the different agencies that are involved, right? There are a lot of different agencies and departments that handle different aspects of immigration. The top 3 are the ones I mainly work with: the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and Department of Justice. The bottom 3, depending on what type of work you do, are agencies that provide different services or funding or programs to immigration cases. And so depending on the work that you do, you will be interacting with the Department of Labor, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Education. Oh. So what does each agency do? The USCIS is U.S. Citizens and Immigration Services. So that is basically the agency here in the United States that deals with all of the immigration, for the most part, a majority of the immigration petitions. And they're in charge of reviewing those immigration petitions and determining whether the person is eligible for that petition or not, and adjudicating those petitions. So when you think about USCIS, it is the immigration office within the United States who is handling all of those petitions. So a majority of the people have some sort of interaction with USCIS. So for example, if a family member, a US citizen, is petitioning for their spouse, whether their spouse is in the United States or outside the United States, the very first thing we have to do is file the I-130, which is filed with USCIS. And then depending on where that spouse is, we then continue the process with USCIS, or we also work with the Department of State. CBP is U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. So they are basically the officers at the borders or at the ports of entries at the airports, facilitating the inspections and the entries of immigrants or legal permanent residents coming into the United States and determining whether they are allowed to enter. Now, sometimes we have individuals, like, for example, DACA individuals that ask for advanced parole. We get the advanced parole approved, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that CBP at the border or at the airport will allow them entry. They still have discretions to allow an individual to determine whether the individual can enter the United States or not. Then we have ICE. So ICE is U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they're basically the officers that, when we think of ICE, those are the individuals that are coming either to someone's home to place them in detention centers, or they are monitoring on the streets and asking individuals for their paperwork to determine whether they have status to be here or not. So those are the individuals none of my clients ever want to be in front of or faced with. Then we have the Department of State. So the Department of State is, think about it as the agency who is abroad, handling all of the cases and working with the different embassies and consulates on different visa matters. So if a person is trying to solicit a tourist visa, they're working with Department of State. If, for example, on my initial hypothetical of the US citizen spouse petitioning for another spouse, if the spouse is abroad in another country, then we file the I-130 with USCIS, and then the case, once it is approved, it is transferred to the Department of State, and then they, with the NVC Center, are in charge of facilitating the process with the embassies to schedule the interview, collect all the documentation necessary for the interview, and then conduct the interview to then determine whether the person is eligible to enter the United States. And then we have the Department of Justice, and that's basically our immigration court. Within the immigration court, we have EOIR, which is the first level of the court system. So when someone is placed in removal proceedings, in deportation proceedings, they start at EOIR to have their trial. And then if the individual either loses their trial or they win, but the government wants to appeal, then the next route up is the BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals, who then determines whether the trial judge made a correct finding or not. And so with that one, I'm mainly, it's when I'm working on deportation cases. Now, sometimes we think deportation cases, if we have court one day, we think like other court systems that we'll get another court date in like a week or two or next month. Unfortunately, with the court system in immigration, our next court date can be a year or two out. Many times I go to court, file my appearance, we make the pleadings on the case, and then the next court date available will be another year, 2 years. We'll have cases before immigration court that can last up to 10 years or more. And so because there are just so many individuals in removal proceedings that the judges are very behind, and so these cases can go on for a very long time, depending on the judge's availability and the amount of people that are in removal proceedings. And then we have the Department of Labor. And so the Department of Labor are for attorneys who are working on employment-based cases. So I do a lot of different immigration work, but I limit my work so I can specialize and focus in certain areas. So one of the areas that I do not focus on is employment related. So I normally don't interact too much with the Department of Labor. Then we have the Department of Health and Human Services. And so within that department, we have the Office of Refugee Resettlement, Migrant Head Start Program, and then the Migrant Health Program. Now that we kind of have an overview of what are all the different agencies and departments that handle different immigration cases, I want to go into talking about the type of petitions that are available for individuals to gain some sort of a lawful status or temporary status. So the first one that's the most common are family-based immigration petitions. And under family-based immigration petitions, we have kind of two different categories. We have immediate relatives, and then we have preference categories. So for immediate relatives, the most important thing with this one is that it's unlimited. There is no limitation or no waiting period on when the individual can petition the person, but there are restrictions on who are immediate relatives. So immediate relatives are only for US citizens. So if someone's a lawful permanent resident and they want to petition their relative, unfortunately, they are under the preference category. So they would have to determine when. We would have to check the visa bulletin to see, depending on the country they're from, and the category that they fall under and the relative, will see how long that process will take for them. But for US citizens and have immediate relatives, which are their spouses, unmarried minor children, and parents, they can petition for them at any time and don't ever have to wait for a visa to become available. So the first thing I always do when I'm speaking to my clients is trying to determine, is the petitioner a US citizen or a legal permanent resident, and who are you petitioning? And then depending on that, I can then determine whether they will have to wait or whether the visa will be available for them immediately. Now, if they fall under a preference category, we have different levels of preference categories. We have, if they are a US citizen, but they are petitioning for their unmarried adult child, then there is a certain amount allocated per country for that individual. If they are a lawful permanent resident petitioning for their spouses and minor children, again, a different category. If they are a lawful permanent resident petitioning for their unmarried adult child, another category. And now if they are US citizens petitioning for their married adult child, or they're petitioning for their brothers or sisters, depending on the person's status and who the family member is that they are petitioning, we will have to determine which of the categories they fall under to then be able to explain to my clients how long will this process take and what are the steps involved for that process. And so one example that always takes the longest is US citizens petitioning for their brothers or sisters. Those petitions, for example, with Mexico, they are taking about 20 plus years. Right now, they are processing cases from like 97 to 2001. And so that can be a very long period of time that the individual is waiting. Now, when these individuals petition for whomever of these preference category family members, they will do the initial I-130 for them. And then after that is when we determine, depending on what category they are in, how long they are going to be waiting. Now, that initial petition, unfortunately, does not provide the family member any type of benefits. It's kind of like, think about getting a ticket for the line that you're going to be waiting, right? They get their petition approved, we have a priority date, and now we're just monitoring that priority date to see when that priority date becomes current with the visa bulletin online. And then once their priority date becomes current, we can then move forward with processing everything depending on where they are. If they're in the United States, continuing the process here, or if they're outside, continuing the process with NBC and the Department of State to start processing their interview. But in the meantime, even if they are abroad or they are in the United States, they don't have any benefits other than an approved petition that they can use once their priority date becomes current. Now, depending on when the person also filed that initial I-130, they can also have other benefits. During 1996 to 2001, we had the benefits of 245I. And so that benefit is really amazing for individuals who are now able to gain their green card. If those individuals entered unlawfully into the United States and they don't want to return back to their home country to do their interview, they can use that petition between 1996 and 2001 whenever they applied and use the benefit of the 245I to not have to leave the country and only pay $1,000 penalty and continue to do the process in the United States, so long as, again, there are no inadmissible issues, right? So when we talk about inadmissibility, I kind of tell my clients it's, violations that would make you essentially ineligible for the green card. So we try to determine which route they have to take. Are they eligible for 245I? Have they had a petition filed back during that period? And then if so, then determining their immigration inadmissibility issues to see that those are not then going to cause them a problem moving forward. Then we have employment-based And so here the US provides various ways of immigrants who have valuable skills to be able to come to the country either on a temporary or a permanent basis. So depending on the employment visa, it will either be temporary or it could lead to a more permanent status in the United States. And then we have refugees and asylees. And so these petitions are for individuals who are fleeing persecution and are unable to return back to their home country due to life-threatening or extraordinary conditions, right? And so these applications, I see a lot of these applications as well, and it's always very unfortunate because many of the individuals have suffered so much in their home country, but unfortunately, despite all that they've suffered or all that has happened to them, if we can't meet all of the different eligibility requirements, then the government will not issue them asylum or refugee status. And so for this one, I try to really break it down to my clients when I'm doing the consultation to try to really understand what was the harm and was that harm related to one of the protected classes, right? And so there are only a certain amount of protected classes based on your national origin, due to your race, due to political opinion, due to membership in a particular social group. And so I try to show them also the application so they can see the little boxes. And then we talk through the process. Like, was the reason why somebody did X, Y, and Z to you because of your race? Or was it because of your national origin? Or was it, what was the connection there, right? Because many times these cases are denied because the judges claim that there is no nexus. We cannot show that the harm that the person suffered was because of one of these protected classes. And if you can't make that connection clearly to the judge, then they will deny the case. And most of these cases are usually denied there. It is very difficult to gain asylum. And then on top of the challenges of trying to prove all the elements and the connection and the credibility of the individuals, then we have the constant changes of law, that it is an area of law within immigration that is consistently changing over time. And so it's trying to balance, trying to understand all of the current legal requirements, and then also making sure that the client is eligible and meeting all those requirements, right? So these cases take a tremendous amount of work and effort to be able to help the clients gain refugee or asylum status. Then we have the diversity visa program. So it's a lottery that is allotted to countries that have low rates of immigration cases. And so each year the government provides 55,000 visas and they just randomly issue them. So individuals from these countries that are eligible will sign up for the lottery, and then they will be notified if they won the lottery or not, and then continue through the process of the diversity program. Then we have humanitarian relief. So these cases, these types of petitions are temporary status. So they are not permanent. Some of them, depending on what the situation is, can lead to permanent status, but some of them will continue to just be temporary and only really provide the benefits of protection against deportation, the ability to have a work permit, and then be able to get their social, their ID, their licenses, and then have to renew that status every so often, so long as the program continues. So here we have DACA, which I think many of us are familiar with DACA. And so DACA is given to young children who entered the country and studied, were here during a certain time period, and then can prove all that physical presence. And so with individuals that I have DACA with, in the future, if they're able to marry or have a relative that will be able to help them gain their lawful permanent status, we try to see if we can transition them to some more permanent status. But in the meantime, if they don't have anyone, then we continue to just renew their DACA. Now, DACA has been up and down throughout the years, being removed, being reinstated, advanced parole being allowed and not. Currently, right now, DACA is only available for, advanced parole is available for DACA, and it's only for individuals who have, who are renewing. Individuals who have never applied and were trying to apply for the very first time, right now, they could technically still submit their application, but USCIS is not actually adjudicating. They are accepting them, but they are not adjudicating those initial applications. Now, if somebody had DACA and they let it expire for a very long time, they can still renew, but they would have to prove up all the physical presence again, but they wouldn't be considered initial applicants. And so I work with a lot of DACA clients to renew their DACAs or get them advanced parole, so that advanced parole will then allow them that in the future, if they are eligible, if let's say they entered unlawfully when they were kids, if they entered unlawfully, they would have to go back to their home country to have the interview. But in order to kind of avoid that process, we try to do advanced parole to give them the ability to leave the country with permission, re-enter, and once they've had that lawful inspection, they are then able to do the adjustment of status in the United States with their spouse who's petitioning for them or their relative who's petitioning for them. And that would kind of avoid the having to return to their home country to be able to
Ms. Dominguez, sorry to interrupt. One more minute to wrap the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, and then U visas are for victims of crimes. T visas are for victims of trafficking. Then we have temporary protected status for countries that that the government has issued are going through some type of crisis and they are giving TPS. And then lastly, we have citizenship for individuals who had a lawful permanent residence for about 5 years, can demonstrate physical presence, good moral character, and as we can see, pass the English and civics exam. And then where are cases processed? So like I mentioned, outside and inside the United States, or a combination of both, depending on the situation. So some of my recommendations here that I've seen just by working with so many individuals is first addressing the huge COVID backlog. There is a huge backlog, especially outside of the US. For example, in Mexico, they are about 80,000 people are currently waiting for interviews, which that essentially means it's taking almost 2 years to process. So we definitely need to address that COVID backlog, the consular processing delays. In the past, when I first started about 9 years ago, a case would take me 5 to 6 months to process. Now, cases are taking anywhere between 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, a very long time, depending on the situation. Every petition is taking at least a minimum of a year. So it's really important to understand how long these cases are taking. And they're taking so long that sometimes different things happen to the individual that then make them ineligible, all because the process was taking so long. Or it's also heartbreaking to see that I'm working with the citizens here, and they just recently got married and they haven't even been able to live with their spouse for the past 2 years because the consular processing time is taking so long. We also need to increase the number of visas for the preference categories, because like I mentioned, if a brother or sister from a US citizen wants a petition for their brother or sister in Mexico, it's taking almost 20 years for that to happen, right? If we increase those numbers of visa categories, then those numbers of how long the person has to wait will be reduced. We also need to increase the annual cap for U visas. U visas are for victims of crimes. It's taking almost 5 to 6 years to process those cases because they only allot 10,000 all across the US, right? So now we've got victims of crimes who have gone through so much and then still have to wait almost 5 years to have any sort of benefit. Luckily, the Biden administration last summer is now providing work permits and protection against deportation and the benefits a little bit ahead of time, but we're still seeing that right now they're still processing under that program cases from 2017. So anyone applying right now are still waiting about another year or two until they kind of catch up with the cases. Then also another big one is allowing US citizen children to be qualifying relatives for hardship waivers. So those are the waivers that individuals who entered unlawfully need to be able to go back and not be denied at the interview. And unfortunately, those waivers are only given to family members, to 2 qualifying relatives, your US citizen spouse or parent, or lawful permanent spouse or parents. So when the immigrant only has their child to be able to petition for them, and they entered unlawfully, unfortunately, they will never be able to see the end of that process because they'll be stuck on the waiver part. If they don't have the waiver and they entered unlawfully and have been here unlawfully for a certain period of time and they leave for their interview without that waiver, they will never come back from Mexico. They'll be automatically denied because of the lack of that waiver. And so I always see many parents who I unfortunately have to tell that if their child is the only one and they entered unlawfully and they don't have a qualified relative for the waiver, they are not eligible. And so that is really heartbreaking and discouraging. We definitely need to try to push to add U.S. citizen children as qualifying relatives. The other one that is also—
Ms. Dominguez, I am sorry to interrupt this ever important topic, but for the sake of time, we're going to need to move to the next presenter.
No problem.
And as you can see in the chat, there are already many questions that hopefully you will be able to address. Thank you so much for your presentation.
No problem. Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
You guys have my presentation, so everything's on there.
It was extremely interesting, and I'm sure many will have questions.
You're welcome.
Our next presenter is Dr. Nicholas Kaufmann. Dr. Kaufmann is a research professor in the Department of Psychology in la Universidad Autónoma de San Luis Potosí, Mexico. The title of his presentation is Psychosocial Impact of Deportation, Experiences Upon Returning to Mexico. Dr. Kaufmann, the screen is yours. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I wish, before going on with the talk, to thank, of course, the Illinois Mexican and Mexican American Students Initiative, in particular, Dr. Elvira de Mejia, for her invitation, Dr. Timothy Killeen, Ramón Cepeda, Reyna Torres, y Amalia Pallares, including as well Stephanie Torres and Nancy Salinas for their excellent organizational work. Today's presentation will be in collaboration with Stephanie Beltran del Rio. Together, we have conducted a qualitative study on the psychosocial impact of deportation, experiences upon returning to Mexico. Stephanie Beltran del Rio works with refugees, asylum seekers, and other vulnerable migrants as the cross-border protection coordinator for the International Rescue Committee in Mexico, where she has previously worked as women protection and empowerment manager in Ciudad Juárez and senior program manager in the deployment with Afghan refugees in Mexico. She has a master's degree in human rights by the Thomas University of San Luis Potosí and a bachelor's degree in communication and media studies from the Tecnológico de Monterrey, Mexico. As for myself, I'm actively involved in the Autonomous University of San Luis Potosí here in Mexico's Human Rights, Public Health, and Peace and Conflict Studies International Graduate Programs. Additionally, I am a liaison officer of the Internationalization Department, as well as the Defense of University Rights Department. I have earned my PhD in Community and Prevention Research from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and my research is grounded in a human rights approach with an emphasis on qualitative methods and centers on the intersection between health, gender, and interculturality across diverse transnational contexts in Latin America. There has been increased hostility and human rights violations through US immigration policies and processes. In fact, as Human Rights Watch argues, many of these deportations threaten a range of fundamental human rights, including the right to family unity, the right to seek asylum from persecution, the right to humane treatment in detention, and the right to due process in the rights of children. As we shall see from our study, focusing on a recent period between 2015 and 2018, two of the main changes that the interviewees faced during their stay in the US were the prosecution for immigration offenses as a federal crime and the collaboration of local police agencies with immigration authorities to detain people with quote unquote irregular immigration status based on the control of what is quote unquote different, and that quote as such endangers the unity of the same, of what is similar. Some of the cases presented here were victims of this new agency of power that caused them to be deported. Now, repression by political and economic power has a police face. The criminalization of immigrants, especially deportees, has been materialized both in the United States as well as in Mexico through means of legislation, political rhetoric, and political media public media outlets. To take one example from Donald Trump's 2016 campaign speech, we will put an end to the dismal law-evading policies of the Obama administration, which allows thousands of foreign-born criminals to walk free on our streets, do whatever they want. Crime is everywhere. As well, the Mexican consulate in El Paso was quoted to say, in a short time, immigrants will become a real danger to public safety. The Trump administration had dramatically ramped up immigration arrests inside the US, while it scapegoated millions of people by painting them as violent criminals who should be deported. The administration claimed it was focusing on serious violent criminals, but President Trump's new policies made every unauthorized immigrant a target, regardless of their actual criminal history. The crackdown was also sweeping in immigrants, or among immigrants who are legal residents, but who were convicted of sometimes only minor or old criminal offenses. While total removal numbers did not undergo significant changes in the Trump administration, deportation by ICE from within the country, as opposed to from the Mexican border, rose dramatically insofar as we could identify a 25% growth in 2017 compared to the previous year and 17% more for 2018. The process of detention, deportation, and return includes being detained at or near the border after a routine check or arrest, in a raid at home or at the workplace. Persons convicted of federal crimes, example, drug trafficking, illegal re-entry, go to federal prison, while persons convicted of misdemeanors, example, driving under the influence of alcohol, domestic violence, immigration violations, go to the state or local prison. When transferred to the Immigration Detention Center, two possible situations arise. These centers have individuals in deportation proceedings after being detained at the border crossing under administrative arrest or after serving a criminal sentence. However, persons detained by immigration agencies may be incarcerated in immigration detention centers or in local or state prisons with persons serving a criminal sentence. Some general aspects of the deportation processes, including the definition of the return points, are determined in the binational agreement memorandum of understanding on the safe, orderly, dignified, and humane repatriation of Mexican nationals of 2004, which originally established 26 official repatriation points, although some have sporadic use, to receive deportees. As of 2018, with the update of the local repatriation arrangements between Mexico and the United States, only 11 such ports extended along the northern border have been designated, which does not actually represent a complex redistribution of deportations due to the fact that they were already the most used return points. Thus, Tijuana, San Isidro, and Mexicali, Calexico, in Baja California, San Luis Rio Colorado, Yuma, and Nogales in Sonora, Ciudad Juárez, El Paso, to name just a few, are now the official immigration modules for the reception of deported nationals, although the other points may be used in cases of emergency or when the person is originally from the area. Once at the repatriation modules, deportees are received by agents from the Instituto Nacional de Migración in Mexico, who, according to the Institute's official sources, provide food, water, discounts on bus tickets, telephone calls, medical attention, local transportation to shelters, processing and delivery of identification note documents, support in recovering belongings, and information on federal programs. Some of these services, however, are provided by non-governmental shelters in the respective cities and are contingent, of course, upon adherence. So for our study, we identified what was missing in the literature. That is to say, qualitative studies on the phenomena of deportation and return to Mexico. We also identified that research needs to integrate, research on migration needs to integrate the different phases of the migratory process, not just one in particular as emigration could be, or deportation as such, or detention, but the overall process, including these different phases. We also identified that studies on deportation needed to adopt a critical perspective and as well as a human rights approach. As well, the studies needed to focus on people's experiences, their subjectivity, as opposed to reporting numbers and statistics, albeit important, but nonetheless insufficient to understanding the experiences of those deported. So our study was grounded in a theoretical framework that integrates several community-based participatory approaches. Rather than taking on classical migration theories to address return migration, we adopted a systems theory for analysis. Our study was based on principles of liberation psychology, locating it in the periphery and Latin American reality. A human rights approach was used as a tool to understand people's struggle. As for detention and deportation, we neither considered it a return nor a repatriation, while we also recognize that the authoritarian deportation regime was in and of itself focused on the quote-unquote illegality of people's stay in the United States. And as for the return of these people, it is not necessarily the conclusion of the migratory trajectory, nor the reinsertion to the place of origin. It is subject to a stage of decision-making. The interviews with deported nationals were conducted at the Casa del Migrante in Ciudad Juarez, where in addition to the profile and general data of the persons, such as age, place of origin, place and time of residence in the United States, among others, the following topics were covered: experience in the various migratory phases, participation of the Mexican government, construction of social networks, violation of rights, needs, plans, and adaptation strategies in the return. Considering that migration is a multi-stage process, which requires its contemplation through a procedural model in which the development of the different phases as well as their interdependencies are taken into account. For the analysis, the stages of emigration, stay, detention, and deportation were taken into consideration, since according to the contemporary theoretical proposals, the study of migration should be considered as a complex process of interdependent phases and not as isolated events. Therefore, it is assumed that some of the experiences lived in each stage can directly and indirectly influence the rest of the phases of the process, paying special attention to deportation and the construction of return strategies. As we can see from interviews, deportation had different meanings among those interviewed. For one, I will select a couple or up to three extracts from the interviews. Deportation can be considered a tragedy. As one interviewee called Ulysses said, "No, the truth is that my world fell apart, because the truth is that here in Mexico, I have nothing. When they caught me, my world fell apart. I became sad. In fact, there were nights I cried. I cried for the sake of my family." For others, deportation also brought forth a series of plans. As Samuel says, for a moment, I made decisions long before I had to go back. I was already angry. I had plans in December to go back, in December of this year. But then they caught me and brought me back where I am now. There is no reason to be afraid, I said then. Anyway, one day I will return. And clearly, deportation means a violation of human rights, as Omar had stated. I didn't come here to cause harm or to be bad or to do bad things, but they treated us all like criminals, handcuffed, chained up wherever we went, from the waist, arms, even feet. And it feels terrible because we were not charged for huge crimes. Most of us were experiencing migration. Many were simply there for a traffic infraction, and the immigration enforcement went after them simply for that reason. So if we were to consider from the analysis of these extracts that the interviewees were providing us with, the psychosocial impact of deportation, we could use the analytical framework based on Thomas Feist in 1997, whereby to understand experiences, we could look at them from a macro-structural level, a meso-relational level, and a micro-individual level, which is akin to somewhat to the ecological level, popularly known within community psychology. As for the macro-structural level, we know that the reproduction of criminalization and the implementation of restrictive immigration policies increase the state of vulnerability and non-rights among those who are in the states under an immigration status. At the meso-relational level, interviewees shared with us their belief of deportation being unjust, unforeseen, and subject to an aggressive process, whereby they were treated as criminals versus non-citizens, so to speak. The emotions that they felt encompass pain, sadness, guilt, impotence, courage, as well as disappointment. And of course, the uncertainty upon returning to Mexico reproduces in themselves a state of vulnerability. However, the autonomous decision-making process that they undergo in Mexico to relocate is conditioned by structural factors such as political, economical, and sociocultural forces, both in Mexico and the United States. And at the micro-individual level, we identified there to be a demand among those who were interviewed for respect and recognition as persons and not criminals nor deportees. There is a road to emancipation we identified, which depended on individual resources and values. It was a slow path, but yet a direct one. So, to end this presentation, I would just like to thank the interviewees, Cesar, Hernan, Jerry, Katia, Marcos, Omar, Pascual, Perla, Samuel, and Ulises. And of course, along with Stephanie Beltran, I am absolutely available to take any questions and share more of the findings from this wonderful study we did together. Thank you.
Dr. Kaufmann, thank you so much for such an eye-opening presentation. I hope we will have the opportunity to get the audience to ask a few questions. For sure, you feel free to post any questions on the chat. And if the presenters are still around, hopefully they will be able to address them. Our final presenter today is Dr. Dana Rusch, Assistant Professor in the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The title of her presentation is Impact of Immigration Policies on Mental Health and How to Intervene. Dr. Rusch, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can pull up my presentation here. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I know we're a little pressed for time, but I'm very grateful to be part of this very important symposium. As was stated, I'm a professor of clinical psychiatry here at UIC. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm going to talk a bit more today about some policy impacts on mental health. And I'll describe the Immigrant Family Mental Health Advocacy Program that I created and direct at UIC with some specific examples of policy advocacy in my work and the important role of community-based organizations in mental health promotion. So let's see. So I know that some of my previous presenters kind of put this into the global context, but I think it's really worth repeating. So when we kind of zoom out the lens to think about global migration, we are in unprecedented times of forced human migration globally. So in 2020, we had 82.4 forcibly displaced individuals worldwide, 42% of which are children. As a child psychologist, this is of critical importance to me. In 2020, there were over 1 million new asylum claims globally, with the US leading the charge of those seeking asylum within our borders. And we have about 14% of our US population are foreign born, and 11 million of whom are estimated to be with undocumented status. 1 in 4 children have at least one immigrant parent, with increasing numbers of children with at least one or both parents who are undocumented, and about 25% of them are Latino. And we have a large number of US-born children who have a DACA recipient parent. And so when we think about kind of the policy scape, we have to keep these statistics in mind. And I want to just bring this to the Illinois level for those of you who are maybe not familiar. This is a very busy slide. You can digest it later when you have access to the presentations. But you know, when we think about the policy impacts at our state and local level, we really have to keep these data in mind. So our state has about 14% of its residents are foreign born. We have a large number of those with undocumented status in Illinois, the majority of whom are residing in Cook County, where Chicago is located. Chicago is actually the 6th largest city population of those with undocumented status. And Illinois typically ranks within the top 5 of states with children with undocumented status. And we participated since the 70s in US refugee resettlement. We have a large number of asylum seekers who are awaiting the adjudication of their cases in Illinois Immigration Court, as my previous presenter was alluding to, which has a very large backlog of cases. And Illinois has always been one of the largest states of DACA eligible and DACA recipients, and including those children with DACA recipient parents. And so we really need to keep this in mind when we're thinking about the mental health impact of immigration policies. Oops, there we go. So this is a really nice framework, I think, and again, my fellow presenters have talked about the structural and social determinants of health and mental health. This is a framework put together by BARI, the Bay Area Health Inequities Initiative. And this really highlights the impact of structural and systemic inequities that particularly and disproportionately impact ethnic and racial minority youth in low-resourced, high-need communities. And we see that undocumented status poses unique and complex risks for both child and adult health outcomes. And this is only further exacerbated by anti-immigrant policies and rhetoric that, you know, fuel the fire, if you will, and really exacerbate psychological distress, mistrust in systems of care, and creating systemic barriers to accessing needed care. And again, I want to just put this in the frame of mental health. And so when we think about the process of migration and the migration journey, this is a table that kind of gives you a sense of the different risk and resiliency factors that occur across that process, all the way from pre-flight experiences like war and unrest and persecution, economic instability in one's home country, to the journey itself of migrating, which includes loss of community, traveling long distances, oftentimes detention by immigration authorities, interaction with different systems, to the post-migration and resettlement context. And across all of these factors, we see that policies and regulatory changes can exacerbate the impact of these factors in a kind of a cumulative way. So this program that I created back in around 2018 was really a formal solidification of the work I have been doing for quite some time. I've always worked with a team of mental health services researchers here in Chicago where I trained that really focused on how do we increase and access to mental health services for kids and families in Chicago. But I was really seeing a growing and urgent need to address the particular context of Latino immigrant families that I was working with. And more importantly, I saw a need for making more intentional and thoughtful connections between research, practice, and policy to address longstanding inequity, not only in Chicago, but across the US. And I really wanted to align clinical science training at the Institute for Juvenile Research with its original mission, which was serving the most vulnerable and marginalized families. I'm going to talk a little bit about these different components of the program moving forward in my presentation. So first, I'm an outpatient bilingual psychologist. I work with children and adolescents from Latino immigrant families, most of which are mixed status, many of whom are transnational, and the majority are Mexican. I also work with UIC students who are impacted by immigration-related stressors. This could be DACA recipients, those who are undocumented, those who are facing the detention or deportation of a family member. And I also work with young adult asylum seekers who arrived as unaccompanied minors, all of whom are from Central America, but all of whom have had transit experiences through Mexico. And I work with them after their release from ORR custody. And they present with a range of psychological difficulties and symptomatology, but the majority of the patients I work with have presenting anxiety and depression. Many of the school-age children I work with are struggling with attention and behavior and learning challenges. And the asylum seekers that I'm working with really are presenting with significant mood dysregulation, complex trauma, and suicidality. So in this clinical model of care, I really wanted my clinical practice to be informed by what was happening at the policy level. I wanted to prepare trainees to engage in policy advocacy toward the goal of increasing equity for the patients and families that we were serving. And I really wanted the empirically supported interventions that we have available to us to better integrate family support services, empowerment and advocacy strategies, intentional attention to culture and context and family preferences, and also preparing trainees for ongoing consultation with other systems, including legal advocates, teachers, school advocates. And I'll talk about this at the end of my presentation, but this is also designed to dovetail with building community workforce capacity. So in general, the clinical model of care is kind of, looking at what we have available to us in terms of empirically supported treatments, which is on the left-hand side here, some of the kind of main ingredients, but kind of looking for better opportunities to really address the context that immigrant families are coming to the clinic contending with. And so moving beyond assessing symptoms and functional impairment to thinking about family coping and resilience, which a lot of the previous presenters today talked about, depathologizing distress in the wake of anti-immigrant rhetoric. How do we not only identify treatment goals and kind of monitor those goals, but how do we think about action planning, doing some ongoing needs assessment and resource mapping with families? And across the intervention spectrums with families, how do we think about how are they responding to treatment, but how are we building advocacy skills? How are we increasing their sense of empowerment as they navigate community systems and resist injustices? And so as I was launching this kind of clinical model of care, I was becoming more and more immersed in the policy landscape and trying to track rapidly changing policy issues. I'm not a policy analyst. I don't have a background in immigration law, but I found that these issues were so critical for me understanding the lived experiences of the communities that I was working with in the clinic and also the research questions I was asking. And so here are just some examples of some of the policy reports that were emerging at, early on in this program. And of course, anti-immigrant and immigration policy did not begin and end with the previous administration, and policy have always wavered between kind of maybe more expansive policies like amnesty and guest worker programs to more restrictive policies like increasing border security, and that has always been in existence, but this was happening at such a rapid and quick pace, and it was becoming more and more clear to me that this really needed to be integrated into the way that we're training clinicians and researchers to think about immigration justice. And so here is an example. I know, again, sorry, this is a very busy slide, but it's just a list of some of the things that I started updating my fellow clinicians and researchers at the Institute for Juvenile Research and in the Department of Psychiatry on how do you keep track of these rapidly complex policy changes that are happening, particularly if you're not an immigration scholar, nor someone who's very well versed or, conversant in policy issues. And so I provided some updates to raise awareness, to educate my colleagues, and also to highlight action areas and policy advocacy efforts. And this ranged from things related to DACA, to what was happening at the Supreme Court with DACA, to what was happening with immigration enforcement, and also some resource guides that helped people better understand some of the terms and some of the information that was coming at them. Another example of policy advocacy in this program is how do we leverage as clinical scientists and researchers the information we have, both our clinical knowledge and our research knowledge, towards data-informed equity. Meaning, how do we participate in the regulatory process? How do we participate in other types of policy advocacy? And so on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of the public comment periods. Don't have time today to talk about the regulatory process, but the public comment period is a wonderful advocacy tool for scholars, community members, providers, educators to participate in policy change. And so what my data-driven comments focused on are what are the mental health implications of these proposed regulatory changes. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some national advocacy efforts and more local Illinois, Chicago advocacy efforts that were really focused on, broadly speaking, equity and access for immigrant and communities. And at the next two slides, I'm going to give you an example of policy advocacy that it was a collaborative effort with my colleagues that really puts our research into action. And so here is a statement by the Society for Community Research and Action, which is the Community Psychology Division of the American Psychological Association. We were approached, we have an immigrant justice special interest group, and one of our members was approached by an immigration lawyer asking for a research-based, kind of evidence-based document that showcased the negative impacts of immigration, detention, and deportation on communities. And we really didn't know of one, so we got to writing it. And we quickly turned around a comprehensive summary with policy recommendations that turned into an official policy statement. And we included infographic guides that could lead advocacy efforts with different stakeholder groups. And all of this is available on the links provided here, including the full statement was translated into Spanish. And as we were working on that first policy statement, many of us thought that although we recognize the importance of it and how crucial and critical it was to have that document, we didn't think it best represented what we were seeing in our work and in our own experiences with resistance movements and activism. And so we wanted to create a subsequent report and policy statement that really focused on resistance to oppression and how communities organize around this. And so again, we have companion guides that are available in English and Spanish that highlight some practice kind of recommendations for different settings, from community-based organizations, which I'll talk a little bit more about, to municipalities, to workplaces and unions. And again, I have the link here so you can access that information after the presentations today. So my final few minutes remaining, I just want to talk briefly about the research component of this program. So this I'm part of a larger mental health services research team at the Institute for Juvenile Research, and we focus a lot on how do we move mental health out of clinics and into community? How do we think about mental health as we do public health? And how do we think about the social ecology of children and families? And while we understand that specialty mental health services and clinic-based services are necessary, they certainly are not sufficient. And so we ask some critical questions. We ask, where does mental health happen? So mental health happens in family, in community, and in natural spaces. Who are the key opinion leaders and non-traditional providers that are necessary for promoting mental health in those spaces? And how do we align mental health with the goals of those spaces? So for example, when we work with schools, we talk a lot about how to align mental health with learning goals, with behavior management in classrooms. And finally, how do we do this? How do we make mental health kind of integrated into the day-to-day operations of these settings? And so I started thinking a lot about the places and spaces that immigrant families spend a lot of their time. And as was mentioned many times today, I thought about community-based organizations who are on the front line of providing many types of supports that typically address the more urgent and pressing needs of families. They have a visible and credible presence in communities. And importantly, their organizational mission is typically aligned with being culturally responsive, building capacity, focusing on empowering the communities they serve. And I thought that this was really critical to thinking about their role in mental health promotion. And so my team has worked a lot on thinking about how do we expand the mental health workforce to include community paraprofessionals broadly defined. And in our work, we found that this workforce is uniquely positioned to leverage their contextual knowledge of families and communities, whether that's cultural knowledge, specific knowledge of a neighborhood, knowledge about kind of family-school relationships and the history of those relationships. And this helps them to increase engagement and responsivity to services and to mental health messaging. And so this is a really critical workforce for delivering skills and messages to parents who are parenting children in very high stress contexts. And so with a few of my colleagues, we published a conceptual paper that talked about what does this look like? What is a CBO model of mental health promotion, particularly for Latino immigrant families here in Chicago, but broadly, across the US. And we thought about the what. So what is it that community organizations are doing? And we really wanted to focus on support for parents and support around advocacy and empowerment. And we thought about some ideas about how training models for CBO staff could be very important. And so I'm going to briefly just I'll go over the next two slides and then I'll be done. We focused on these two components because they were the evidence base. We have an evidence base of kind of community-based interventions that focus on parenting and that focus on advocacy and empowerment. And we wanted to bring those two things together toward the goal of kind of mitigating the impact of immigration policies on families. And so finally, I just want to say that when we are training CBO staff, we really want to test and follow this implementation and see how we can better help CBO staff integrate mental health messaging into their day-to-day with families, not turning them into de facto mental health clinics, but really leveraging and amplifying the work that they're doing with families and helping them feel more equipped to be part of the mental health solution for these communities. Thank you so much. Here's my contact information. I'm happy to provide any further information. Thank you.